Are we good? Okay, welcome to the Indian River Lagoon Council meeting on this, the 11th day of August, which is the 223rd day of 2017. I want to throw out a little trivia to you. Did you know on this day, back in 1928, Babe Ruth clubbed his 500th home run? Is that cool? And of course, everybody knows he was the very first to accomplish that feat. But he did it 88 years ago today on this day in history. So that's your little bit of useless trivia to start your day.
That raises the bar of what we need to accomplish.
Yes, it does. So now on to the serious business of restoring our beloved lagoon. So I call this meeting to order, and I will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do we have any agenda revisions?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Staff is recommending on consent item 7, small grants program, RFP. We have some new information, and we'd like to move that to old business.
Okay. Yeah, is it not already under old business?
I think we have one more. Agenda revision, Mr. David Peters was going to give a presentation, so that is canceled for today. He had an emergency, in a family emergency.
Okay.
And then we have an add-on today from the management board meeting. We'd like to add an 8A1 to new business, atmospheric monitoring station, and then whatever the council would like to do.
So when we get to, excuse me, so when we get to 8A1, you want me to refer back to you?
Yeah, we're going to look to Kathy to make sure we keep track.
Good. Okay, good. Kathy, we depend on you so much. What would we do without you? I hope we don't have to find out. Okay, is that all the agenda revisions? Okay, I'd like to recognize Florida Representative Gail Harrell. Thank you. You want to do that? Okay. Well, I want to recognize Representative Harrell. I already started doing that, so let's say hello to her, and then we'll do.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to speak just a few minutes. I won't take too much of your time. The first thing I want to do is thank you for what you do in order to really preserve the Indian River Lagoon. As we all know, we all live in this beautiful area, and it is truly the most unique of estuaries, certainly the most biodiverse of estuaries in the entire world. And for us who live here, it is not only an environmental treasure, but an economic treasure as well. So we really appreciate your dedication and having the council. I want to say how important this council is to really speak with one voice and have a coordinated effort across all the counties, from Volusia County all the way down to Martin County, that it impacts. And as you speak together with one voice and come up with your recommendations, we in the legislature will be listening to you. And I'm really here to talk about two things today. First of all, I have been very involved, as you know, over the last many years in what is happening with SERP and the releases from Lake Okeechobee and the impact on the Treasure Coast. As part of that endeavor, we have experienced in our area, as you all have experienced across Lagoon, major algae blooms. And last year was devastating. And we had cyanobacteria in the St. Lucie River, in the Indian River Lagoon, out actually on the beaches. So we are very concerned about the health aspects of that. And being in the health profession and really chairing the Children, Families, and Seniors Committee and various healthcare committees over the many years in the legislature, the health aspects of this are devastating, and we want to look at the long-term health aspects, as well as the environmental aspects. So we are going to be, in fact, we started pursuing this last year, reinstituting the Algae Bloom Task Force that actually was put in statute back in about 1998, 1999, and really was originally instituted to address the red tide over on the west coast of Florida. However, algae blooms, as we know, are in the lake, they're in the lagoon, they're everywhere. It's in, anywhere there's hot weather, warm water, and algae. It's algae blooms. So we really want to reinstitute that, and we're going to be holding a meeting of the algae bloom, or the beginning, hopefully, of the reinstitution of the task force on September 19th that we are putting together. And I would invite you all to come to that. I would invite everyone who is interested in the Indian River Lagoon to come to that. It will be a roundtable discussion. We most likely will not have time for public comment. We're going to bring the major players from Fish and Wildlife, from DEP, Department of Health, and the various entities that are involved in the original task force. But we would very much like to encourage folks from the Indian River Lagoon Council to come to that and be part of it, listen and see as we move forward, and recommendations that come out of that. Secondly, as we look long-term in how we are really going to protect the Indian River Lagoon, I think we really need to look very much at what we are doing, what the priorities are, and how we're funding them. As you may know, I'm the primary sponsor of Legacy Florida, and that set a dedicated funding source. 25% of Amendment 1 money goes into the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan and projects that will help end the releases from Lake Okeechobee into the St. Lucie River, the Caloosahatchee River, ultimately the Indian River Lagoon. I think the same kind of concept of a dedicated funding source where you can depend on long-term funding is essential for the Indian River Lagoon. If we are really going to restore and preserve the Indian River Lagoon, this is one of the ways we can do it. As the council, you would be really very helpful to me as we move forward with this concept, that you can give us some direction as to the types of resources you would need, how they would be used, specific projects that really would have the major impact. What are we talking about? You know your communities, you know the parts of the lagoon that you're involved, that you live on, and the types of things that would make the most significant impact in preserving and restoring the Indian River Lagoon. So I ask for your advice as we move forward. I have had many conversations with Dwayne DeFries, your executive director, and we'll be continuing to do this. I am looking long term. I think that is the direction we need to go. We need to have the 2 water management districts that really deal with the lagoon working together. We need to have funding that is directed specifically with partnerships coming out of our cities and counties to address long-term projects that are going to make the most out of those dollars and be able to use those dollars so that we can see the impacts, measurable outcomes, and we will know that we are really restoring the Indian River Lagoon and making sure that we preserve it for future generations. It is truly an amazing treasure that we are so blessed to live on here in this section of Florida. So I asked to partner with you, to have you be my advisors and assistants in doing this and looking long term. and how we come to a dedicated funding source coming out of Amendment 1 money that would allow us to do essentially what we are doing with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan in moving forward, knowing we have dollars there year after year will be of great benefit. So I'd kind of like to, if you have any questions or anything, I'd like to just, be available to you. If you have a minute, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or you can contact me individually.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, and we
thank
look.
you for your help and your work in the legislature.
Well, we are very excited about this. We've concentrated pretty much on the St. Lucie and the releases from Lake Okeechobee, and we're well on the way with Legacy Florida to really being able long-term to deal with that. We have our reservoir being built south of the lake. We have the dedicated funding source to be able to complete projects, plan complete projects. And, I think we need to do the same type of thing for the Indian River Lagoon. And hopefully this will, as we move forward, we'll be able to put this together. But, and your participation is key to where we go from here. So,
Thank
Mr. Chair,
thank you.
Representative, thank you. Your September 19th roundtable discussion that
Yes.
you alluded to, where will that be held?
it'll be at Indian River State College in Fort Pierce.
Okay, and
I believe it's Fort Pierce? Yes, in Fort Pierce.
very good. So I'm sure we'll be notified of that. But I want to thank you too for the consideration of a dedicated funding source again for a long-term effect of where we're going to go to restore and preserve the lagoon. That's going to be critical going forward with the project. So thank you so much. Thanks for your help.
Thank you.
Good to see you
very
again.
much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Fielding, you want to,
Minor formality, why don't we approve the agenda?
okay.
And move that we approve the agenda as proposed.
Okay, we need a motion to do that?
Yes.
Okay,
Second.
so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
None opposed, it passes. What is it, we have 7-0. Okay, no more agenda revisions. We'll go into public comment. We have one speaker's card from Sergio Mota. Would you like to come forward, please?
Hello, my name is Sergio Mota. I reside here in Sebastian over on Joy Haven 365 Joy Haven Drive. It's certainly an honor to be here. I'm representing the Young Democrats of Indian River County, and today I will be speaking about our plastic bag ban petition that we're trying to promote. I know recently in the state legislature, one state representative by the name of David Richardson, he's tried to promote the plastic bag ban petition 3 times, and each of those 3 times have failed in the state legislature, both in the House and of course in the Senate. But we're trying to promote the petition here locally in our municipality, starting with Vero, then hopefully Sebastian. And we're looking really for support from other organizations, pro-environmental groups like Keeping Indian River Beautiful, and such as the Lagoon Council, to really help us in promoting this idea locally with municipalities. And I think it's an issue that's not only important here domestically in the United States, but it's also been raised by countries like Costa Rica, which plans to be the first country in the world to promote plastic bag ban, to really eliminate the plastic bags, because they really have a detrimental impact on our lagoon and other sources of wildlife. So I know we plan on speaking to the Vero Beach City Council in the coming months, and hopefully the Sebastian City Council in the coming months, and we look forward to really promoting this idea. I appreciate your time. I know some commissioners have traveled from long ways to be here, and I appreciate the public being here as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mota.
Mr. Chair.
You have the floor, Mr. Fielding.
This idea has some momentum. I think it might be useful for us to at least have some discussion in the future. when we would have opportunity to have some agenda item presented so that we might, there are ramifications. I mean, it's not just this clear shot. So I would encourage us, if the board wish, to have further discussion about the item. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Any other thoughts on that from the board? No? I'll just mention that it has been mentioned at one of our board meetings in Brevard County, and we've spoken about it. So it's on the front of a lot of people's brains, because I can remember when I was a kid, people talking about jellyfish versus plastic bags and turtles eating them. So that's 150 years ago. So it's probably time to start considering if we should do something about it moving forward. Okay, our first presentation today will be by Mr. Chuck Jacoby.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Conference reports. I was just waiting for Chuck to get to the mic so I could make him walk all the way back.
I was going to say, I thought he was making me walk all the way up here so he could send me all the way back.
Yeah, conference reports first, item 4.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Getting ahead of myself. Conference reports. Bob Yulovich. Chuck, I just wanted to see if you were paying attention.
You missed the meeting, we gotta retrain you. Chris did a good job in your absence. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Mr. Tredick, good to see you here. Brandon, Sue, as always, Ed, Deb, Tom, and my buddy Chris. As chair, one of the things that Dwayne did, and we talked about, and I'm presuming they all got this, it's a very effective document, is the executive summary and then the read comments. I just want to clarify something. I say this every meeting. Don't mistake the unanimous votes that we're all in lockstep. There's a lot of discussion, and as you can see by the length of some of the read comments. So sometimes the box score is misleading, and I'll get into details on some of that. So using your council agenda, we'll go down some of these issues. Some of the issues not noted that we talked about very briefly was Rockwood just doing a septic tank conversion, so they give us an update on that. We also have asked for follow-up discussions and follow-up to initial discussions on flushing and water farming, particularly as it's going on, dispersed water management in St. John's. Turning to your agenda, item number, the financial stuff, we had a informational meeting of the Finance Committee, which is chaired by Joe Swimmer. And even though they did not have a quorum, they were able to have an informational meeting and then bring that meeting informational information to our full board. So references to financial matters, those were vetted by that and then vetted by the management board. I'm giving you that as not as telling you to just take at, but letting you know that there's an additional level of review that we've always said that we'll provide to you. Looking at 8D, Special District Services, Marty Smithman had suggested, and a great suggestion. I know Marty's group at the Inlet District is a member of Florida Association of Special Districts, and the two agencies that I ran for 15 years were also members, and we found them to be able to give us backgrounds in HR matters and all that, legal advice and other things. And the point of that discussion was that when we re-look at our administrative services component with SDS or whomever in future, that we may be able to reduce that or supplement that or complement that with Florida Association of Special District Services. So the board, and I know particularly Marty and I have had experiences there, strongly encourage this district this district getting involved in Florida Association of Special Districts membership. The procurement, number 8E, of those of you who looked at the 852 photos of the truck, I was so taken that I'm going to hang this one in my wall, because the biggest value in the truck I determined was the tire and the mystery box with Frank's name on it, okay? So We also discussed the potential, that's a state price. We also discussed, I had used for many years the Florida Sheriff's Association, so there's two opportunities to look at that. Another thing that Frank and I talked about that I practice, the two districts I ran were both in Indian River County, and oftentimes we've got a state price that might have been from Jacksonville or something. And what I would do is I would go to local dealerships, in this case, and I would ask them if they can match it. My preference was to keep the money local. If most of the money for the districts I ran were coming out of Indian River County or St. Lucie, I was motivated to try to keep the money local as it's come. So if a dealership was able to match that, or come within $100, I'd get approval from the board. We would encourage that. So that's just something I suggested to Frank. Carol, I'm hoping it's okay that, if they equal that, or if they don't equal it, they come within a few dollars or so that the board can prove it. But we had talked about, motivated to keep the money locally on any purchases such as that. So we moved to approve that. The small grants, the new appointments, we have a new appointment. And then we've been talking about FDOT being the member, and then Dwayne had some discussions with them, and given the potential conflicts, they would probably be better served in an ex officio capacity, and we agreed to that. We'll be communicating primarily with District 5 and at times with District 4. 8A, there was Dwayne mentioned an agenda modification that will affect both your 16-17 and 17-18 budget. And the item that is noted on your cheat sheet, a new business, new agenda item, addition by staff, is the atmospheric monitoring. And even though the final score is 22-1, I want to let you know there was a lot of discussion on that. And the discussion centered around passing the buck without the buck. This is a critical sole monitoring unit that funding has been lost for. And they came to the council, and we're not the richest relative in the block. And just as I was thinking, another member indicated that they are in a similar situation, losing funding. I'm concerned that this council, we cannot set a precedent, and that this council cannot be the end all. If dad says no, mom says yes type relationship. So, because we are not the richest kid in the block and richest relative. So even though that passed, I can tell you with some comfort standing here that its continuation beyond the 2-year agreement that the management board said and is at risk. And the other thing about this situation is monitoring is often the most neglected component of the work that we're doing. And to stand up here and say that there's one station that does both a wet and dry atmospheric in this lagoon is just ridiculous. So that's one of our charges, is to move forward on that. So I just want to let you know that that's a situation that we voted yes on by a significant margin, but one did not go without a lot of talk. The next item, 8B, the business plan. I had a hissy fit on that. I got off track of my mantra to be professional, consistent, objective. My concerns were directed to a Mandalay Margarita Stormwater Improvement District in Sewell's Point. And my hissy fit was influenced by recent actions by Sewell's Point relative to septic sewer conversion. When I removed that, and staff, and others straightened me out, and I removed that from the agenda and just looked at the benefits of reducing 8 potential or 6 to 8 potential discharges in the lagoon and condense them through a stormwater treatment area, I realized the benefits. But again, that was an area that was discussed, and one that does cause you to scratch your head in some puzzlement at times. Okay. That's it for the glue. We have a great management board, a lot of energy, a lot of dynamics, a lot of intelligence in there, and I'm honored to serve as their chair, and I'm proud to have the membership we have. Any questions?
Yes.
Yes. thank you for your report. The question on the, at your meeting, was there any discussion among the management board regarding the monitoring atmospheric deposition? You didn't have that before your meeting started. You were presented with it at the meeting, correct?
Yes, yes. And we had a hell of a lot of discussion, Deb. The two primary things was the dollar coming down to us.
Right.
Okay. And we knew that that would potentially open the door for others to say the same thing. That Volusia may have a program co-sponsored by somebody they're looking at losing funding to, or other areas. So I was worried about the precedent there. And then the second thing is fortunately we have on the board a person that's been involved with that station for 20 plus years on the initial. But the sadness is that you have this one monitoring device in this location that you're expected to extrapolate data beyond any reasonable amount of extrapolation. Okay, so that's it, one.
Well, I guess, but my question was, that was new information to you when you walked into the room. You didn't have advance notice that it was on the agenda?
No, it was handed to us.
That from a policy maker or a board position probably puts up more red flags to me. That's one of my hot buttons on any board or commission or anything that I sit on. That makes me uneasy to begin with. The question then, is this time sensitive, that it had to be at the management board at that particular
I
time?
absolutely think it was time sensitive due to the fact that funding was going to be terminated, probably effective August 1. We will not meet again. You will not meet again until after October 1, which is the
So
commencement.
effective October 1 or August 1? October 1?
I believe October 1 is when the fiscal funding year cycle starts for the new fiscal year. Okay. Am I correct?
Yes, it was time sensitive. We had attempted, we knew this was kind of coming our direction. We had tried to get funding from EPA. We were not aware of how significant that timeline was until just recently. And my decision to bring this to a management board at this meeting rather than waiting to October was the worry that we could have that station dismantled in the interim, which would then increase our cost if we were going to bring it back up.
Yep, that makes sense. And that's what I was trying to get to, because I have had some concerns of no prior notice in the meeting, so but there's, well, it just is what it is, but thank you.
Oh, well, we also, you're going to address two budget amendments, which we had to deal with, the $25,000 for 16-17, $25,000 for 17-18, which we had to also address too, so it all became part of that bigger pie of events. So that was timed to October as well. So a lot of things went into this, but it didn't go without a lot of discussion.
So then the question is, and I know that we'll be talking about this later in our budget and the actual agenda item, but in your management discussion, is this going to be taking from, did you feel this was going to take away from any commitment from any other project?
It's coming from reserves.
From reserves, okay.
Right.
That's what I need, thank you.
Okay,
So-
you're quite welcome. Good question.
Mr. Fielding, you have comments?
Couple things. Yes, I think when we're looking at state money, so monitoring tends to be the stepchild. Monitoring is the source. Monitoring gives us the underlying foundation to know where to start doing and looking and thinking. Monitoring is essential. So my guess is that who didn't get sufficient money or thought they didn't have sufficient money, and so they cut monitoring was, I guess it's St. John's. I don't know.
That would be a good guess in this
Okay,
case.
all right. My guess was that was St. John's. So.
Not that we're going to all look at Bill now.
Yeah, well, I looked at him first so he could die. But we might want to, as a board, we might want to send encouragements both to the district and to St. John's that monitoring is essential. But they then look to guidance from the legislature. And so that's who we're really saying, legislature
That's who I'm
monitoring is
saying.
essential.
You know, my pontification is that we got a situation, we've recognized the deficiency in monitoring, we recognize the criticalness of monitoring to be successful in representing our fiduciary responsibilities. We put money into a plan, if we're not monitoring, it's a terrible plan. And you know, my talking to you is basically talking globally to everyone that's listening, saying that we need to work collectively to put in a better network in that lagoon.
Yeah. In this specific case, what we're looking at is a monitoring of nitrogen and phosphorus. I think that's the only place.
It's the only wet and dry location.
That we're doing this in the entire 157 miles.
Yes.
Which gives us how useful of an input, I'm not sure, but so we need more of this. Now, what we, Martin County, what we're doing, we're going into partnership with NOAA.
Okay.
And so we are getting some fairly sophisticated
Good.
kinds of monitoring, but it's stuff, so far, it's stuff that
But, you know, the goal,
assigned to
Ed,
us.
would be to join, have a network. Your
I'm
network.
agreeing, and that's why I
Yeah.
said yes. So we need that. We need, and when we're talking about some kind of long-term funding, we need some kind of a dedicated funding to have a monitoring system, which would involve, I would hope it would involve the lake, that it would involve the upper reaches of the Kissimmee, that would involve the lagoon. So it would be this flow so that we could gain some scientific evidence of what we need to do to start addressing. For instance, right now in the lagoon, in the lake, we're finding, and I don't know, Diane's here, so she may even address it, but we're finding that the algae is increasing significantly. And so this thing bounces between toxicity and being fairly placid. So we need the monitoring.
Right.
We need, and so there are other issues, but this is the one that's
Yeah,
coming up
you know-
now. And I would suggest that we, as a council, that we establish a resolution that would, and not try to draft it on the fly,
Right.
but a resolution that would emphasize and give some particulars, the essential elements of monitoring, and that we support this, and that we're asking those of our constituents, the districts, DEP, legislature, that they help us.
I would
That's
seize, I would seize the opportunity that Representative Harrell gave this morning and start putting this on my list of, my wish list or my legislative action list. I mean, with a resolution or whatever, but Representative Harrell stood here and talked about legacy, and legacy is a great opportunity for us. And you know, we could start doing that list. Okay. Anything else?
Sure.
Mr.
I want to weigh in.
Sadowski.
A couple things. I was encouraged by Representative Harrell's presentation this morning, and Representative, I think you're hearing really about the comprehensive approach and some of the things we're facing from a dedicated funding source. You know, looking at estuaries, springs, and bays, you know, we could, you know, the state could be looking at a dedicated funding source for each of those elements within the state from that standpoint. And Bob, clarify for me, the management committee is familiar with the atmospheric monitoring system, because I
We have a member from Indian River County that's been there since its birth.
So my point is that,
Right.
you know, and I recognize the commissioner's concerns, because I hate when I get something at the last minute and I feel like I'm put under the gun. But in this case, you actually, and you have experts at the table, and that's why you're
Right.
you're there as that comprehensive review and that expertise at the table. So you weren't blindsided really, but you
No.
you had that information. You could talk about it. You could
Well, you know, I'm a seasoned and scarred veteran of all this stuff. So.
seasoned. You're like blackened.
Cajun. It's the you know, Brandon, you're new. It's the Pittsburgh thing, buddy.
But no, that was just my point, is that I understood that. And then from the monitoring side, if we were able to dedicate, you know, tens of millions of dollars in a dedicated source, we could do the monitoring. We could, you know, really, and I like the comprehensive vision that the representative provided, is that collectively here we have, you know, 5 counties at the table. We have FDEP, we have South Florida, St. John's. We have all the elements at the table for this particular side of the state. And so if we worked collectively, and there was that element, which is the NEP, and Dr. DeFries as the leader, pulling all those things together to get the absolute best possible outcomes. What I also heard from the monitoring side, nitrogen, just a lightning storm alone, you could see an increase of nitrogen input from that kind of an input. So knowing where the input is coming from, reducing the input, saves us billions of dollars on the removing of the outcome.
Right.
And so we've got to look closer at how we are either permitting issues upland, things that are getting into the watershed upland, and then making their way to the watersheds. That's an area that is relatively cheap by comparison of trying to remove it. So that's what we're looking at from the comprehensive side. But I am encouraged by Representative Harrell's presentation today, and I think that we have, in San Luis County, we'll be having a meeting with the representative and sharing some of our
As was I. Just to recap and be a little redundant, we have that one instrument, okay, and as you extrapolate further and further, your quality of your information dissipates, and you're not being strong science. So I just wanted to close with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes my report.
Thank you, sir. Dr. DeFries, I'd like to know if you would like to weigh in or if you have any thoughts with regard to Mr. Fielding's proposal for a resolution.
We're going to address this item in new business, and I'd like to address it there.
Okay.
I think a resolution may be useful, but I'm going to connect some dots on this. So if you don't mind, we can wait.
Yeah, that's good.
One thing I would like, I'll say it now for all three of our conferences. First we reorganized structure, and now we're in that cultural reorganization. And I can tell you from our last three meetings, the STEM AC, Citizens Advisory Committee, and the Management Board, we are finally operating as a functional national estuary program with robust and intense discussion, some dissension, but I am really pleased at where we are. And so Bob did mention it, that when you see these votes, none of these votes happen without a lot of intellectual capacity and looking through the deep thoughts of what's the long-term impacts. And so you all have done a wonderful job at choosing the right people for your appointments on these committees. They are functioning very strongly in our behalf.
Thank you, sir. Okay, now the board would like to hear from Dr. Jacoby.
Thank you. Chuck Jacoby with the St. John's River Water Management District, and I'm the chair of the STEM Advisory Committee. So I'm going to give you a very brief update on our last meeting. So we have some ongoing things that we're attempting to do, one of which is collect biographies, short biographies of the individuals who are members of the organizations that are represented on the committee. There are 22 organizations, including sort of emeritus or ad hoc academics in the community. And the idea there is to get these biographies together and show the breadth and the depth of the expertise that we draw on when we make decisions about the lagoon. The second thing that we talked about was pulling together our thoughts on, what is it that we feel we need to know? How can science help the management, and what is it right down to the sort of action plan level that hopefully the estuary program can pick a set of targets that it will handle, that will become its own from the collection that we'll put together. So we're gathering up some ideas from the committee, and there's several plans afoot to move this sort of thinking forward. And we'll probably come up with a couple different documents at different levels dealing with how science and management interact. But most of that meeting that we had, probably a little over 2 hours, which was scheduled for 40 minutes, was to look at the Mosquito Lagoon Reasonable Assurance Plan and where that currently stands. So we had one of the consultants there who presented on the thinking behind it at this time and where they are going. And there was a reasonable amount of debate. I felt for Tony Janicki standing up there. He was sweating by the end of the 2 hours, I can tell you. But the debate focused on understanding how this process will go. And there are some nuances in there, so you may well hear people talk about we don't have the right data or we don't have enough data. I'd say just take a deep breath and we're happy to chat about what we do know, how these decisions will come to. There's everything from optics through politics to science involved in this decision. So this is a challenge for everybody. A reasonable assurance plan, in case you haven't heard of one, that's a sort of locally driven way to move towards protecting and restoring a water body. So Mosquito Lagoon, out of all the sections of the Indian River Lagoon system, is the one section that doesn't have a total maximum daily load and a basin management action plan. So that's moving forward, and we'll see where the stakeholders take it. And that was pretty much our meeting.
Thank you, sir. Any questions from the board? Comments? Thank you, sir. Sure.
And the reason we don't have on Mosquito Lagoon is because it's not been determined to be impaired, which I think is totally misguided. But I'm just asserting my opinion at the moment so that it might reflect actually why I get frustrated with this process. Thank you, sir.
Duly noted. Next, I'd like to welcome up Frank Catino from Satellite Beach Citizens Advisory Committee.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Frank Catino. I am the chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee. I'm also the mayor of Satellite Beach. And for a little bit of history, 60 years ago today, Satellite Beach was founded, became a city.
So you were just a little boy then, right?
I was. The Citizens Advisory Board met August 1st with the purpose of developing a small grants program. We felt very strong that it was important to get citizens' engagement. And one of the discussions came from Brevard County that we just passed a half-cent sales tax. We had tremendous citizen engagement. Held hands across it, passed by over 70%. Where are they today? And where are the children today that we need to teach that the practices we used for the last 70 years didn't work? Because look at the shape of the lagoon, or we all wouldn't be here. So we're looking at how do we develop this program to hit the most citizen engagement. We first started looking at grants that were $2,500 to $10,000 range, and we found that those type of grants, if they were gone after by cities, would kind of fall into a range that a city or a municipality wouldn't put that amount of time out and effort to get a small grant like that. It took too much personnel time to do it. I know in our city, there's limits that we go after grants just because of the amount of time. So we dropped it to the range of $500 to $5,000 grants, and the grants will be judged on how they demonstrate citizen engagements and their involvement into the lagoon. We also have talked about setting up citizens meetings in each of the counties that border the lagoon. I believe Volusia did theirs already. Brevard, we're planning ours, and we're planning the rest of these to gain citizens' engagements. But we feel that this grant program will help in many ways trying to get more people involved with the lagoon. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, now we'll move into presentations. And we'll welcome back Dr. Jacoby.
Thank you. And this time up, I will give you a little background on the conditions in the northern part of the system. So salinities have tended to be relatively high. The rainfall hasn't yet dropped salinities very much. So they're in the 30s. Seawater's 35. Further north you go, when you get up into sort of Mosquito Lagoon area, they can be above 35 even yet at the moment. They may drop a bit, particularly if we continue to get rain. The temperatures are still quite warm, so they're probably around 90 degrees Fahrenheit in most places, which is pretty warm water. The Secchi depths, which is the measure of water clarity, have been pretty good. So, 4 foot plus in many places. Beginning to see a little change, particularly in Mosquito Lagoon, the southern part of Mosquito Lagoon. In terms of chlorophyll, the values are typically low, so typically below 10 milligrams per liter, and that's below the level that we would worry about a bloom. But in some places, you'll get them higher, up to 20 and maybe even up to 40. And so what we're seeing seems to be, it's a somewhat typical, if you look before 2011, summer. So we get pyridinium, which is a dinoflagellate that gives you the bioluminescence. It also, which everybody loves, it also gives you, in some cases, it can give you saxitoxin, which leads to paralytic shellfish poisoning in some instances. We also get diatom pseudonychia. That's been blooming recently, and that one likewise can produce a toxin, domoic acid, which is amnesic shellfish poisoning. But the patches that we see are relatively small. So Port Canaveral, there were 106,000 cells of pyridinium per liter in a sample that was taken as a bloom sample, so a targeted sample there. Cocoa Beach Golf Course, 158,000 cells of pyridinium. Barefoot Bay, just up the road, 1,600,000 cells of pseudonychia. So you get these patches of reasonably intense blooms, but they're relatively small. They aren't coalescing. They don't seem to be driving oxygen levels low, except in very closed conditions like canals. So there have been some small fish kills in some of the canals. Generally speaking, we're not looking at a 2016 March event like we saw last year. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Sadowski.
We don't have a set of sampling that would try to track back to the cause. Once again, once things get in the lagoon, they mix. And so, tracking back to sources is a pretty impressive effort in most cases. I think, right.
Anything? Oh, sorry about that. I keep forgetting that. Sorry, thanks. If there were golf courses nearby or something that you could at least generally gain a cause and effect.
Yeah, so most of these bloom samples that I mentioned were taken from shore. They were typically, oftentimes taken by volunteers, citizens. So they would not be out in the middle of the lagoon. And they're often tucked in by a fairly large canal system or a freshwater input. So in a sense, the cause-effect link is there, but tracking exact sources take a lot of effort.
Again, it just goes back to my point about the input. Knowing where the input is, so we know, what the cause and effect are, and that goes back to the monitoring, whether it's a Kilroy or a Lobo. Those again, finding the upstream inputs are going to be important for us to find solutions when it gets to the lagoon.
Anyone else? Thank you, Doctor.
Greetings, Diane Hughes with Martin County Engineering Department. I only have a few things to report today. Water conditions in the St. Lucie Estuary and Indian River Lagoon and at Lake Okeechobee. Levels at Lake Okeechobee are at 13.808 as of midnight last night. A week ago, they were about 13.05, so it's been pretty steady for the past week. A month ago, the levels were at 12.46 feet, and a year ago, they were at 14.75 feet. Inflows into the St. Lucie River and Estuary have more than doubled over the past week, so we're now at 26 CFS at this point in time. All those are from our local basin runoff, and about 1/3 of that is from our tidal basins. There are no flows from the lake coming into our system right now. There have been blue-green algae blooms reported on the lake in the northern area, on the northwest and the northeast. DEP has gone out and taken samples. Microcystis has been reported as one of the organisms in the bloom, as well as others, but only one sample is tested positive for toxins, and that was a 1.9 micrograms per liter. Central Marine, where we had one of the large thick mats last summer, is reporting conditions that kind of look yucky to them. DEP is keeping an eye on it, but they have not seen any algae blooms within that basin. The Health Department in Martin County has issued an advisory at Layton Park to avoid contact with the water due to bacteria, not algae at this point in time. We've been under that advisory for over a month. It is my understanding that the results on Monday look good, but since our flows are now increasing to the basin, next week is likely not to look good, but things can be odd, as they do happen sometimes. St. Lucie has also had some high counts of bacteria on the North Fork. Over the past month at Veterans Park and River Park Marina, they're coming down, but with continued rains, they might be going back up as well. That's all I have at this point in time. If you have any questions.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
So I've got here information speed round.
Good morning. On behalf of FWC, my name is Jeff Beal. Thank you so much for allowing me to address the council today. And wanted the council to be aware of a multi-partner team that's focusing on habitat restoration, aquatic habitat restoration within the Indian River Lagoon. And I'll preface the comments by saying that when we think about estuarine restoration, we mostly think at the 10,000-foot view, as this schematic shows you. This is the features of the IRL South plan. We mostly think of restoration in terms of large-scale watershed planning, stormwater and TMDLs, and of course all of that is a critical focus. But I'd like us to consider the next scale this morning, which is at the habitat restoration scale. And of course these two work in concert. It easily slips us into the chicken-egg argument, which is more important, that we get the water right or that we get the habitat right? And the answer to that is we need to be working on both. With the caveat that, of course, there are locations where we cannot do habitat restoration because water quality precludes us from doing so. So we have to proceed with caution in those instances. And so the teams that I'd like to introduce you to today are referred to as estuarine restoration teams. And the vision of those teams is to create healthy, thriving estuarine habitats of sufficient quantity and quality. As the council's well aware, we've lost quite a few of our aquatic habitats in the lagoon, and therefore restoration is of critical importance. And our mission, in other words, how we accomplish this goal, is that we facilitate and implement restoration projects. We build a partner network so that we can communicate and leverage funds and partner together to garner funds. We provide technical assistance to one another. For some habitats, we know a great deal about how to restore them. For others, not so much. So it's often important for us to discuss those techniques and the permitting associated and all of those sorts of details. And when I talk about estuarine habitats, I mean specifically coastal marshes, mangroves, oyster reefs, living shorelines, and seagrasses. And the first team that we formed was actually what we call Northeast Florida, and our definition of Northeast here is from the state line to Sebastian Inlet, and there were various reasons why we chose that boundary, but the main point was that within the bulk of that region, we really don't have comprehensive planning for restoration. And without a comprehensive plan, really a document to point to, it's very difficult to get funding for these sorts of projects. So we decided to focus on that region specifically for this. And the steering team, you see on the top of the slide there, is made up of sort of likely suspects of state and federal agencies plus a nonprofit, and Dwayne was able to join us recently, thankfully. And then along the way, we've been able to gain numerous partners, municipalities, universities, even a business, Costa, lots of nonprofits too many logos to fit on one slide, really. And probably our greatest accomplishment to date was we secured a NOAA habitat restoration grant, roughly $3 million over a 3-year period in which we did numerous projects within what we're calling the Northeast region. So this is a team that meets regularly to discuss all of these things that I've mentioned. But we also wanted to let you know that we've also very recently formed what we're calling an East Central Estuarine Restoration Team. And so that boundary will be from Sebastian Inlet to the southern reaches of Palm Beach County. And the good news when it comes to the Indian River Lagoon is that we have a long legacy of restoration work that's been done. So we very much stand on the shoulders of those that have developed a lot of these restoration techniques. So when it comes to restoration of our coastal marshes, as you see in this picture, most of our marshes, of course, were impounded for mosquito control purposes in the mid-1900s. And we understand greatly now how to reconnect those. So most of our marshes have been reconnected at this point. So that's part of the good news. We're also developed some newer techniques. For example, here's a shot of where we're completely taking out the impoundment dike within a marsh. And so there are places in which we can use this technique as well, to the benefit, of course, of fish and wildlife, but also nutrient cycling, right? Coastal marshes play a very big role in the nutrient balance of the lagoon. We have sort of small versions of the Kissimmee River. I'm sure you've heard about the restoration of the Kissimmee. Along the IRL, we have examples of this. This is a picture of the North Fork St. Lucie. It was dredged in the 1920s, straightened. So we have oxbows that are partially or completely isolated from the main branch of the river. So here's an example where we're reconnecting one of those. Again, for the benefit of fish and wildlife, but also water quality. We've also have examples of large-scale spoil island restoration. Well over 100 spoil islands in the Indian River Lagoon, hundreds of acres. Most of them, if you spend any time on them, you know that they're covered in exotics, Australian pine, Brazilian pepper primarily. So here in Fort Pierce, we had an example of where we're able to do a large-scale restoration. This is the DOT mitigation funding, a 10-acre island where we removed all of the non-native vegetation, removed about 90,000 cubic yards of sand, and we're able to turn it into coastal hammock, mangroves, and a seagrass lagoon. So we understand now these multi-million-dollar sorts of large-scale projects, hopefully more on this front in the future. As I mentioned, Palm Beach County is part of this eCert concept, and they've made tremendous strides in doing muck capping. They worked with a consultant down there to develop a sand shooter, so they're able to lay down a thin veneer of sand over many hours and days and weeks to fill dredge holes and cap the muck. And in some cases, they'll bring it up above mean high water, and that's what you're seeing in this instance. And they'll build somewhat of a salt marsh out of it. So lots of work in Palm Beach County. We're going to be relying greatly on them as partners to teach us some of the lessons they've learned. And no doubt you're familiar with some of the oyster restoration work that's happened. This is an interesting one to us in that the IRL has a long history of clams and clam fisheries as well. So we're going to be developing a team that will work alongside our estuarine restoration team. It's a technical advisory sub-team regarding shellfish, both oysters and clams. So lots of issues to be dealt with there. The siting of these sorts of projects is very important to get the water areas that have correct water quality and the right depth and all those things. And then we're also doing salt marsh restoration that has a lot of education component. So this is the old high school site in New Smyrna Beach that we as FWC inherited. We're able to turn 5 acres of it back into salt marsh. And if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, though, you'll see that we put in a living shorelines demonstration project so that waterfront homeowners are able to visit the site and see all their options when it comes to how to stabilize their eroding shoreline in an environmentally friendly manner. And we developed a website called floridalivingshorelines.com in which people can visit and learn more about how to make their waterfront properties more environmentally friendly as well as stable from erosion. And since 2008, the original CCMP that was written, we've worked closely with this document as we've done our restoration planning. And as the council's well aware, you guys will be revamping this with a new update. And so just know that we as a restoration team want to come alongside and be a strong ally in the writing of this. from the habitat restoration perspective. And the documents like our Northeast plan that I mentioned that we developed will play a big role, I think, in helping us do that. We're going to be writing one for the East Central team as well. And the bulk of these sorts of plans are one-page descriptions of projects in which we try to estimate how much they would cost and what benefits we would get to Fish and Wildlife and so forth, what partners should be involved in them. So again, the bulk of these plans is simply to address specific restoration needs. And we feel strongly that these can roll into the updated CCMP. And so again, thank you for your time, and just know that we really would like to be a strong ally with the council on these issues.
Thank you, sir. Any questions from the board? Mr. Fielding?
Just want to thank you very much, Jeff. We appreciate it. I think I'm encouraged, how to say this most more positively. I'm encouraging each one of us, we need it desperately, each one of us, to look to living shorelines as a solution, not just as something that this looks sort of neat. This is a solution. So as we're looking at seawalls, as they fall down, as they get undermined and as they fall down, and everybody wants to put them back up, I'm encouraging each of us as counties, let's get involved in this so that we more strongly get people to move towards living shorelines. That will protect them, and that will help purify the water. But we've got to take action. We can't just allow it because the engineers want to sell seawalls. Maybe it's not just the engineers, maybe it's the concrete people, but somebody really wants to sell seawalls. But it's living shorelines that will be the best for the waterway. It'll actually be best in preserving the land for the homeowner, for the land user. That's how I see life anyhow. So
right. We concur, Ed, and I would add to that, we have ways in which we can redeem seawalls. Various things we can put in front of seawalls, planters of coquina with native plants and so forth. So we're working on some of those concepts.
And riprap and stuff, so you can go in there with mangrove and so, yeah.
Ms. Dennis, you want to share?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment, while I totally agree on the living seawall, the living shoreline, I will tell you, unless you have a hurricane come in, I will tell you, because this last hurricane in Volusia County, and specifically New Smyrna Beach, and the picture here that you have an example, our seawalls held. That's what saved New Smyrna from total devastation when that hurricane hit us almost straight on. And you want to compare Volusia to Flagler County, I don't want to get into all this, but it's because we had a seawall and the dunes supporting that, but because we had a seawall, our seawalls held, and we stopped a whole lot of devastation from the impact of a hurricane. So this, we might be talking on this kind of force, but when a hurricane force hits, sometimes you have to have a seawall. So I'm just trying to put a balance in here, of which I support both. Thank you.
Yeah, we discovered at our demonstration site, it was interesting to see how all of those different techniques fared with the hurricane. And we were surprised that even places with terracing or retaining walls, in other words, walls far upland, did quite well. So.
Under hurricane attack.
Right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Before we go on, I just want to make a couple quick comments. First, I want to thank Jeff Beal. It wasn't shortly after you hired me that the Northeast Estuarine Research Team, reached out and said, you need to sit on our steering committee. And in fact, watching how they did their work influenced my recommendations to you on how we were going to structure our Science Advisory Committee greatly. We just had a joint meeting of the NERT and the ESERT, this extended southern group at Harbor Branch, and I think we had, 80 people, Jeff? It was about 80 people. So this is a deep resource of knowledge, multiple agencies, and so we just wanted to share with you how this is going to function with us. Once we stand up that ESERT team, they will serve as a task force to our STEM AC and to our management board as we do the CCMP. They're not obligated. Many of them are serving, like Jeff is on our management board. They're inside our system. When they meet looking at science, They're not under sunshine. This is not an organized NGO. They are meeting because this is a good way to do work when you get everybody together. And so you will be hearing a lot of back and forth and interaction, and they will be a viable component of the work we do. One of our last proposals, the satellite beach proposal, both Jeff and I did a walkthrough looking to see how we can enhance that proposal and decrease costs on one of our projects. So I just wanted to thank FWC, all the partners there, and Jeff in particular for reaching out so early and integrating us into great works that they've done already.
Thank you for that input. Do we have Dr. Hunt here?
So I'm Dr. Jessica Lunt, and I work at the Smithsonian Marine Station, and I and my team were a recipient of a grant this past year from the NEP. The grant is titled Bivalves at Work, and so I wanted to kind of frame this as to why we were asking for the money and what we were doing. And so we've been talking about living shorelines, and we know that bivalves are an important part of the living sea line and living shoreline, and that they provide quite a few ecosystem services to us. And so that's something that the human part of the ecosystem derives from a natural system existing as it is. And so, oops. Uh-oh. Am I pushing the wrong?
Sorry, I didn't give you that. It's a down one.
The down one. Okay, sorry, excuse me. So they provide coastal protection. They also provide habitat for a lot of animals that we like commercially and recreationally. I think one of their most important ecosystem services that they provide is benthic pelagic coupling, and so that's the linkage between the water column and the sediment. And by eating the algae and things that are in the water, they provide food to the bottom dwelling animals as well through both their feces and through their pseudofeces, so things that they don't care to eat but will spit back out. And then they also can provide a fishery resource, which I think a lot of people are hoping as restoration continues, we can go back to having a fishery. One problem that can stem from fisheries is when we overfish them, we lose a lot of those bivalves, and then we also have a tendency to put a lot of nutrients in the water, and so we get these bad water quality conditions that we're faced with now. And so restoration of bivalves is often considered a way that we can fix this water quality issue, because more bivalves will eat more of the algae and hopefully clear the water up. So I wanted to actually look at the efficacy of restoration projects, specifically in the St. Lucie River, to see how much these guys are actually cleaning our river. And so to do that, I use this piece of equipment that I very lovingly call the Monster. This piece of equipment allows us to go out into the field and actually test an animal's ability to filter feed in that place under natural conditions. So we know how they're handling the water as it is in nature as opposed to in the lab. And the way this guy works, so we have an underwater pump that will pump water up onto the dock and into these header tanks, and then that water will flow through all of those little tubes and into the individual chambers. And we take water samples as well as biodeposit samples. So each of these other little chambers has an animal in it, and the biodeposit samples we collect are their feces and their pseudofeces. And so feces are what have actually gone through the digestion process and been ingested and moved through the gut. And pseudofeces are the things that they've pulled onto their gills but decided that they did not want to eat and have rejected. So pseudofeces are actually an important part of the ecosystem because a lot of that then sinks to the bottom because it's been bound together with mucus, and that's what other things will eat. All of these biodeposits are put into these vials individually. I have a team of very dedicated volunteers that pick up oyster poop for 2 hours. And this is tiny and it's very time consuming, but we get a lot of really cool information from it. And so this study was designed to look at 2 species. We look at both the eastern oysters, which are our target for restoration, and we know are very salinity tolerant, which is a problem especially faced in the St. Lucie River. But we're also looking at the hooked mussel, which is a native species that is more abundant than oysters in a lot of these restoration areas and tends to prefer fresher water. That's what our idea is. There hasn't been a lot of work done on these animals, so we're kind of getting a baseline for what these guys can do for us as well. And we looked at 3 different sites. We had a Palm City site where there are relic reefs, but not a lot of living actual reef. And in history has seen lower salinities. We have a site in Stewart where there is a restored reef that has been very successful, and this tends to have a more ideal salinity range. It's about halfway down the St. Lucie River. And then we have a site at Fort Pierce at the Marine Station where there have been some restoration attempts in the area. There are living natural reefs in the area, but it tends to have salinities much higher than we consider ideal for restoration. So what we've found so far, we have about 8 months of the 12 months of data that we're hoping to collect, is that salinities have been much higher than we anticipated. This is probably because we haven't had any outflow so far. We anticipated the Palm City site to be at around the 5 parts per thousand envelope, which is lower than it's right at the threshold of what we think oysters can handle, but we think that the mussels would do much better there. The Stewart location we thought would be about 15, and then we knew that the Fort Pierce site would be around 35. So it's been a little bit higher even there. As you can see from this graph, both Palm City and Stewart have been over 15 the whole time. We saw salinities in the 25 range in Palm City, which was much higher than we thought we would see. Though this last month and June and then again in July, we saw very low salinities because of the runoff that we're experiencing. What we've been really interested in seeing is that both the mussels and the oysters perform about as equally well in each of these sites. So we aren't seeing the trade-off between mussels and oysters that we thought we would see. Each site, each experimental day has about the same number of animals that do eat. So I can't convince all of them to eat every time. I wish I could. But we have an average of about 7 animals, both oysters and 7 mussels that eat at each experimental day, which is pretty good. And we found if we scale these liters per hour up and we transfer them to gallons, that our oysters and our mussels are filtering about 9 to 15 gallons of water per day. Now, one of the big reasons I wanted to do this experiment is because a lot of times when restoration is put forward, we like to say 50 gallons a day. That's the high level, like how much can an oyster filter? People like to say 50 gallons per day. But that is often a lab experiment or something, and you need to look at your area to see what you're actually getting. So as you can see, we're getting a whole lot lower than that 50 gallons per day, but they are doing really well in all of these sites. And even at the low salinities, we didn't see a difference in the low salinity sites, which is surprising, especially with the oysters. And with that, I would like to thank all of the people. This is not a single person job. There's a lot of people on this team that do this, and of course the council for allowing us to work on some of these things.
Any questions, thoughts? I find it extremely fascinating, and the numbers, because I've always heard 50, 55 gallons.
Mm-hmm.
And the real world is not the same as the lab.
It's not.
And your little contraption there you had on the dock,
It's
I
really
can't even
cool.
imagine the thought process that went into that, but it seems to be highly efficient.
It's
pretty
very
amazing.
cool. So we're hoping to keep doing some of this in some other areas as well and really look at differences, especially with the oysters in the St. Lucie River. We're collecting from the St. Lucie River, and they're doing better at the much lower salinities than we thought that they would. And we think this could be potentially because they've adapted to these low salinities because they've had to survive our extended freshwater periods. So we'd really like to look at oysters from other areas as well and see how they would fare in the same conditions.
Thank you, Ms. Lunt.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move into the consent agenda now. Is there anything on here any of the commissioners would like to?
Just as a reminder, Mr. Chair, staff recommended moving 6F to old business.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, just as a comment on the small grant side, we heard from the Citizens Committee this morning regarding citizens' involvement. The River Kids in Martin County have been very successful in their programming, and I think that would be an opportunity to really take a look at multiplying that through each of the counties. St. Lucie County has 50,000 students in its school system, and if we could begin that education component in the school system as a partner, I think that would be something that could be part of their curriculum, but also extending and creating a whole new group of people that will come forward to protect what will be their future. So if something, whenever you're developing these points, these grants, it might be reasonable to reach out to the school systems to be a part of that. Of course, I know our school systems are challenged financially oftentimes, and creating curriculum and materials is often challenging as well from a financial standpoint. So if we could just kind of look at that as an option, you can have a whole army of students along the entire east coast of Florida, if not the entire state, looking at their own watersheds and how they individually impact the watersheds.
I think that would be a great idea. I think when you reach out to the kids, you create interest. That becomes a vested interest. As they grow older, that gets passed along, and then when they become parents, hopefully that will get passed along to their kids. And so the dynamic on many levels is just, it's just a good idea.
Yeah, just look at the, just say no to drugs, or the seatbelt issues. Oftentimes when you talk to the kids, it goes back to home, and the parents are like, "Well, you're doing it wrong, Mom." So anyway.
Any other comments? Okay, moving right along. Okay, so we're gonna move 6F to old business. Any other actions we want to take on these? If not, I'll entertain a motion to pass the consent agenda.
Move approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Anyone wish to vote no? It passes. What is our number? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, we have one more than I thought. 8-0. Passes 8-0. Okay, now we'll move into old business.
You want to start with small grants, since we were just talking about it?
Sure.
You have that, Kathy? You've heard most of the changes on small grants. Just want to reiterate how well the CAC worked. They had a deep discussion about what they really wanted to do from the outcome side, so where they could most influence. But there are a couple of points that I do want to make for the record, which is why I recommended moving this to old business. You had heard on numerous occasions what I thought was my bright idea to move the small grants funding, as we do our accounting, to the specialty license plate dollars. Because of the legislative restrictions on license plate dollars, and not to go into it in depth, but 80% has to be restoration, no research, limited amount of funds for education and outreach. We started to look at our budgeting and said, this is going to be not only a problem for the program of small grants, but an absolute nightmare in trying to account for dollars on the percentage. And so, for the record, I wanted to just let you know that it's our plan, at least, to use local cost share for that, and let all of the license plate sale dollars go to direct restoration projects. That way we don't have to worry about the accounting and the regulatory restrictions legislatively. We're recommending in our budgets later on that we budget $100,000 in next year's budget for 2 RFP cycles. That would be up to $50,000, but that our RFP is going to be quality-based. And so if we don't use those dollars or don't have sufficient need, we'll just roll those dollars forward. And so the change has been not only the approach to how this RFP gets released with this 500 to 5,000, the lower limit, but to make it easy for schools, churches, and those that we want to get involved, like the River Kids. And so this would not be a reimbursable grant. This would be done through a purchase order. We would oversee this just like we do any grant in our program. There would be some light reporting back, but we would be demanding in the RFP clear outcomes. And so the focus is going to be, how many kids are you engaging? What do you want them to learn? How do you know that they're actually learning? So there's going to be some, challenges there, but we think the CAC has done a remarkable job to hone down on really what we need to be doing in engagement. Thank them for their support, and staff's recommendation is to authorize us to move forward and release that RFP, the small grants, with the other round of RFPs that we're anticipating a release in this coming October. So we're cycling what I would call back to a normal year now that we've finally gotten through our 5-year program evaluation.
Any comments from the board?
When we get it, please. I'm sorry, I should have asked before we slipped into the old business 2 or 3 things. One, there was a suggestion made that we become members of the, Bob, what's the name of that?
Florida Association of Special Districts.
Special districts is, I just wondered what the cost might be to do that.
Frank, I think it was $4,000 a year. Was that the annual cost?
Based on your annual budget, so it's probably, I would guess, 3,000 to 4,000.
Yeah, we looked into it right after the meeting. There's some advantages. You know, they provide support, but, you know, it's like any association. You know, a lot of what they're doing is lobbying, but they do have some deep skill sets. And so we're going to look into that opportunity. You know, I've got, based on our bylaws and our purchasing agreements, I can make that decision administratively, but before I did, I wanted to make sure we talked to the Florida Association, see where their values are and what they offer. In this next fiscal year, we'll be re-looking at the SDS contract, and so we'll see those coming together. I think sometime early in fall we'll be coming back to look at the, you know, second round of contracting with SDS, and also bring what those values are from the association.
Please. Yes, sir. We did approve the continuance of the SDS contract, and 2 or 3 things is, one, I think it would be useful for the board to see what kind of a form we use in our solicitation on the grant solicitation and our request for performance or request for when we're.
Proposals.
Yeah. So what kind of form do we use to do that? Also, what kind of form do we use in order to report some of our fairly standard repetitive expenses such as our travel and things? And the reason that I'm suggesting that is, I don't know everybody else, but we've spent several months going through and looking at the state requirements and making sure that all of our standard forms fit all those requirements. And so I wanted to see ours and here, and then it might be that what our guys have done could be useful too, because we do candidly some of the exact same things. I mean, we have some of the same people applying for grants from us that apply for grants for here. So that was one. The other is, in my strong impression, is Special District Services, they work for the board. They work with staff, but they work for the board. I mean, when I look at our board as a county commission, our people, while they work with staff, our auditors, while they work with staff, they work for the board. And that's where I just want to make sure we're good with that.
I agree.
If there were questions or things about that. Okay, that was what I wanted. I had not mentioned back. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your input. Anyone else?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
in our October meeting, we can run this. I think our management board, and maybe the council as well, since we have some new members, you know, may not understand the depth of our accountability and some of the forms we're already using. And so we'll try to put together a reasonable package, because you don't need to look at every single thing, but, you know, we have a lot of obligations federally under Newport guidance and special EPA forms that are different than the state obligations, and we'll try to put a package together so you can see where we are. We are continually working to standardize and increase efficiencies, so we're not having to, redo the same thing over and over again. And, in our second year, I'm starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel on that, but this will be continual improvement, and so we'll bring that to both management board and you in October.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Dwayne, what's going to be the process, the notice process for small grants opportunities? It's not like with, most people have Demand Star or something like that, from a small grant side. Is it going to go to the counties for distribution? Is it going to be something that's centralized through the website or social media? How will people know about the opportunity?
We actually had a conversation about that because this audience is not only new to us, but, I don't think the NEP really ever had a small grants program. We're going to be looking at each of you and your organizations to help us communicate kind of at the governmental level. And we're going to reach out to our deep database, which is growing, not just our members, but then we're going to strategically, use social media, our new website, everything that we've got to try to reach in, because we know that groups like the River Kids, as active as they are, most of those folks are not going on to the NEP website every week to see what we're all doing here. Mm-hmm. And so there's this level of what I would call citizen engagement and information penetration. And so we're going to work with the CAC members. Each of those 4 appointees or 5 appointees that you made actually are ambassadors to your county. And so we're going to be, asking them, who do we need to talk to? How do we best get to churches? Because we know there's a lot of good work being done in the churches, in the schools. So we use the school boards. We have to put all that together between now and October to roll this out. So we're fast tracking, but we're excited, and it'll be 2 cycles. So this first cycle will be, in October, and then 6 months later, we'll run a second cycle to make sure that there's easy access.
Thank you. I'm really excited about the small grant program and the opportunities that it presents. I think it's a good way to kind of raise some public awareness and get more people involved, bring them into the fold, and then hopefully cultivate more volunteers and interest in some of our other committees and boards that we have. So I like how you've kind of switched it around. I think it's going to address what you guys are looking to do. And with that, I go ahead and make a motion to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second for an RFP to implement a small grants program in all 5 Lagoon counties. Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0.
Okay, next item on old business. Last meeting, we had quite a long discussion about RFP process. Were we getting the right projects? Were they meeting, the kind of return on investment values that we discussed? And so, first and foremost, I did a personal staff level deep dive on our process that we used this last year. Saw opportunities for improvement, took all of the suggestions and criticisms, which I liked. I mean, we don't get better unless we're constantly asking how we get better. So I thought that was a great conversation. And I brought 8 recommendations to the management board. And in your handout, and by the way, I'm hoping that handout is useful to you all, the kind of the executive summary, where you can see management board. I'm going to credit staff. They only have 2 days to kind of take what we're doing and put management board in place and get it back out to you. So hopefully that was helpful. But the management board came up with a number of other suggestions. And so we have 14 changes that we're going to make to RFP. None are, major changes, but they all take us to a much more accountable place, including a higher value of service to those who come in to present proposals and those that actually may not actually get an award. So, without violating, process, we want to make sure that if in fact an award was not granted, that there's an ability to look at a series of questions, frequently asked questions. And so we up our game collectively within our communities and our stakeholders, so everybody is putting every year a more competitive RFP. And so I share these. I don't know if you want me to go through them, individually. but there is a consensus that we will continue to focus on those broad areas that we had this last year. They haven't gone away. So the nutrient issues, nutrient remediation, nutrient cycling, how do you reduce nutrients in the system, habitat restoration, and there was a suggestion, and we had it in the language, but the management board said, let's not, underestimate the power of ecosystem health and the human health aspects, particularly, important down in the southern end of the lagoon. So we believe that we have clear direction. I wanted to show this to you. We don't need a motion on this, but our goal as staff is to implement each of these 14 recommendations, and then sometime in the October framework, we will solicit RFPs for our fiscal year 18-19. It's hard to believe how fast we're going through this. So it'll be fiscal year 18-19. Now this is important, because I want you to see how this is going to look, because it's connected to what we're going to see in a few minutes. So imagine RFPs go out in October. We give a longer timeline for RFP development. They will come in January. We will review those with our teams, get them to, the review process within our organizational structure. So as we're moving towards that first preliminary budget, which is March 1, that we already have identified or are close to identifying those projects for the next operational fiscal year. We've got a mandate to have our proposal for the cost share component from EPA. So our work plan has to be to the state, I think, in the May framework, April, May, so we can meet a June deadline. And so our hard commitment is to have a final budget by June. And what this will do is that we'll have a interim budget and this work plan, this business plan in draft from March, April, May. So when we get to that June final budget, we actually have a full business plan with the EPA work plan component that's fully aligned with our budget. And so we're moving to, what I would call a competitive and performance-based budget process for the first time. And that's all I have on this issue, unless you want to make some additional comments or suggestions on RFP.
Mr. Fielder?
I think that will allow us to achieve our mission. And so I very much support that overall flow of concept, that we start earlier and that we start more specifically so that we're addressing, we're soliciting what we want to achieve is the outcome. On item 12, and I just want to make sure that I understand, because one thing that we were hoping to get more definitive results was for the participant or the recipient to actually say, okay, here was the outcome, and they do all the fancy stuff before they get the money, but we want to benefit from the consequence. And so to do that, I think we need to tie, and maybe that's 12, maybe that's what we're doing, but I want to make sure we're tying them in. You've got to give this final report.
It's not only 12, but it's in 8. It's almost a number 4 prioritized match. These one-page executive summaries. So in your detail, you see, the full detail of this. This is the language we're going to be using from here on out, and it's the language of EPA on performance delivery. What are the outputs, the deliverables of each proposal, and what are the outcomes, short-term, mid-term, long-term? And you'll see that language in the business plan in a few minutes, but we are going to drive that language into the day-to-day operations with these proposals, and including the one-page summary. So when they give us an executive summary, in the past, and also the first 2 years, Frank has to interpret what we're given from these contracts and proposals and then put it into the language, the EPA language of what we call NEPORT, and I can never remember what that national reporting standard is. I don't want him ever to have to chase a photograph from one of our contractors again. And so we're going to mandate that consistency, and you will see everything we do, and in fact, including what staff is doing, in that output outcome language. And I think that gets us to where our discussion was on the last term, including quantification. And so if you're going to look at how many feet of shoreline, how many acres of oyster reef, how many people are engaged, we want those quantified numbers, you know, not only in the proposals, but the report out would be a quantified outcome that we can then begin to assemble a database of, you know, well, how many shoreline feet have we actually restored in living shorelines in our first 3 years, so to speak. So we're moving in that direction for this next cycle.
We want validation of consequences.
Validation of consequences is difficult in some cases, but it's not impossible. And so we
I think that's what we need. We need to know this didn't work. We need to know that. Or we need to know somebody, here's what the outcome was. It was beyond our expectations. We need to know both, the whole gamut.
We will do our best. So the spatial and temporal scale of like ecological response is difficult project by project, but challenging our proposers to, you know, identify and quantify. You just saw it with this one project that we saw just a minute ago, this recognition that maybe oysters aren't the only oyster, you know, and that maybe biodiversity on these reef restorations may provide more resilience and more success. I think those are the things that we can do. We'll do our best to drive that.
I'm not asking that we guess what might happen in the future. This is a look back. This is when we've come to the point where we say we've either terminated the project or we've run out of money or whatever it is. So the project has come to some breaking point. At that point, where are we? What has happened? That's what not that we're looking in the future and saying, here's what because I want to know, okay, I want to know that. Sure, that's how you're going to get money. But what did happen?
That's a good point. You know where that tie-in will be? Our CCMP, aligning these projects back to this revised CCMP is where we're going to get that. Because the CCMP, if it is done the way we all want, is going to have those broader outcomes with this incremental pathway to, you know, what you've already determined is our vision, mission, and promise, which is a healthy lagoon. So we'll work towards that. Let's you and I talk as well. So I fully understand kind of the level of information, and then we'll make sure we integrate that as we move forward.
Mr. Frick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dwayne, I just wanted to say thank you for you and staff and the management committee to really think about this. I know it was a lot of discussion about how we evaluate these, and I think the recommendations are very good, and really kind of focus in on I think the important parts that we were talking about, which was, you know, really aligning it with what our priorities are on this council's priorities, and then also making sure that we're funding the right projects. So it's not just because somebody, you know, proposed something in a priority area, but that was a good project and we have outcomes of that. So really appreciate the urgency and the hard work on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zadowski?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Dwayne, also, this goes back to probably several years ago, before you were even here, we're at the Five County Collaborative and having conversations about open source information. You know, we have so many funding sources today that, you know, whether it was funded by the EPA, the FDEP, South Florida, St. John's, or we as a committee, having open source information is important so that, you know, the science and the outcomes can be reviewed and expanded upon. You know, the days of silos can't continue, because we know there's so much data and information out there in books and in papers and so on that have been proprietary. and it's sitting on a shelf somewhere and it's not being helpful to anybody. So this is where we have that opportunity to have that conversation, to talk about open source information, data, statistics, and outcomes. And that's what I think we as a body are able to accomplish in what we sponsor and what we fund, to getting that information to the public.
You just added another line on my table of contents on the CCMP draft. Thank you. I agree.
Chris is always good for adding something.
Sorry, Kurt.
So we don't need an action on that. You know, we have till October, so if you have some thoughts that you want us to incorporate, just give me a call or staff and we'll move forward. Next item under old business, I guess that's, small grants is done, so I guess we're on new business, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
With your permission, I'd like to start with the atmospheric deposition, because your decision there is going to impact our presentations on 2 or 3 items that follow.
Mr. Chairman, we kind of talked about this earlier, to go over old information. I think we heard from the management committee that there was a great deal of discussion on that issue, and I think its staff recommendation is to make that move and to fund it. If I'm not hearing anything from anybody else, I would move that we accept staff recommendation to fund the atmospheric deposition component.
Mr. Fielding?
And I'm not voicing a negative voice, I am voicing a acquisitive voice, and if we're going to slide into being the source of money when folks start backing away from funding things they've done for years and years, are we going to be the source of money? That is a question, that's a concern. The second is this particular project, while it has some uniqueness and value and validity, it is, by being of a singular nature and a single location, has less value for the lagoon than it would have if there were other validating points of reference. By just having one point of reference, it probably is presenting, well, it has to present a very skewed, it has to be skewed because you're looking at too many different input areas for it not to be skewed. So how much value, if we are just continuing this one place, what kind of value, what kind of information is it creating for us that's of value? So I guess those are maybe 3 areas of question. I don't know the answers, but are we going to be setting ourselves up as the source of money when other people have made different choices? And are we going to, in this particular one, is this information of such a nature that it has value and validity, even given the very biased sample, and that's not a bad word, but it's a biased sample. Does it have validity? And if it has validity and utility, is this then saying, wow, we really need to do more of this, and so we need to figure out how to get this kind of equipment put in other places? So those are 3. To me, those are 3 questions.
Ms. Adams?
Well, first, I don't think you had a second, so I will second your motion. And secondly, I share some of the concerns that Commissioner Fielding has, but I would hate to see this go away while we're trying to figure out what our overall funding status is going to be of some taking on more things than maybe we want to. I think that it's better to have one monitoring station than none. So I'm kind of looking at it from that perspective. I do think that we probably need to work on encouraging some more monitoring stations so we can get a better overall umbrella picture of what's going on. But since this is time sensitive and there were some other issues at play that added into this particular issue, I have no problem supporting this at this time, but I would also echo the slippery slope concept that I think the management board discussed and that other people have discussed here.
Mr. Sadowski?
I just wanted to follow up. It begged a question, really. You know, everything we do along the 156 miles of the lagoon is individualized, whether it's a oyster reef and the information comes from that, whether it's bivalve information that comes from that, whether it's the atmosphere deposition monitoring, whether it's in Kilroy or Lobo. Each one of those is localized for that information, gathering statistics information, input, output. And so while we have been driven to create the lagoon-wide overview, we are taking it in small parts and small areas, and every individual piece of that pie is information that we can use. And I like the idea of what Representative Harrell had talked about, is identifying secure funding. If we were able to achieve $10 million a year from the state for the NEP, or for the springs, or for bays, or for estuaries in general, anywhere around the state, each entity could then begin to bring those pieces together, have consistent monitoring throughout the entire, in our case, the lagoon, and then gather that information and have more monitoring with outcome options. So,
Mr. Frick?
Yeah, so I too don't like to be sort of surprised by, having losing some information or so, and I know that's been expressed quite a bit here. I think I support this, this quite a bit, but we have an opportunity here where we have a couple of years. We're talking about, funding this for the next 2 years, and we have an opportunity to explore some of the comments that have been made by the other board members to really figure out, one, what it is that we're going to use this information for. And I know, you put together a nice briefing sheet and talked about, this station had been used for most recently, and, just overall the loading to the lagoon. But moving forward, what do we think we really need that information for? How much, how many of these stations would we need? Do we need just this one, or is it up and down the lagoon? But I think the most important thing is trying to find partners that, maybe that this fits into one of their needs as well. Because the question is still, I think, on the table of whether it's most appropriate for the NEP to be funding this or maybe somebody else. So I think we have an opportunity to kind of explore those questions and maybe come back with some answers. Certainly those would be questions I will have and try and get into specifics 2 years from now if the request is for continuing the funding.
Mr. Fielding?
I think there have been some good comments that would lead us to taking this I see it as emergency action. Emergency action. So taking this emergency action with the understanding that it's emergency action and that we want to explore how this thing's going to turn out, and the utility of the data itself. And maybe that means it's vital, maybe that means what it means, I don't know, but explore those things. So I support the motion.
Any comments from this end?
Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Just real quickly, I just want to interject. I presume that the motion. It's on. I'm sorry, I have a sore throat and a cold. I presume that the motion and the second made by the commissioners includes the authorization for staff to enter into whatever agreements are necessary. Obviously, with the council funding $50,000 for a facility that we don't own and that will have some staff involvement of other agencies. We just need to make sure we have a basic contract that protects you all from whatever.
Yeah, I wanted you to repeat your motion.
well, I expect it to be within the staff recommendation. So that's why I said staff recommendation. So based on that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Dennis, comment? Okay, we have a motion on the floor and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes 8-0.
Mr. Chairman, as a follow-up on that, just simply the idea of additional funding. We have NOAA and we have the National Weather Center, each of which, they have their weather information. So this could be an opportunity for NOAA and the National Weather Center, who follows lightning strikes, and even the local weather centers could be helpful to us. And they might want to be a part of the funding side of that, so that that information could be funded, it could be collected, and we can report back to each of those agencies with the support of some funding from each of those agencies. So this is an option, an idea.
Doctor, what do you think of that thought?
You will see when we look at the business plan that chasing new revenue is one of our top 10 priorities. This particular issue I see as an opportunity. Monitoring has always been one of the hallmarks of effective national estuary programs. And so even though this came in an emergency situation, I actually see this as a tremendous opportunity for us to work closer with DEP, water management districts, in a full partnership as we begin to look at the challenges of comprehensive monitoring, mapping, and modeling. It's a challenge that's statewide, and we're all struggling with what do we need, when do we need it, what's the data, QA, QC. It's an important part of what we do. So we will look to other sources of funding as we move forward.
I'm sure you will.
All right, next item. We prepared two different versions, so Kathy, I'm gonna hope that you've got the right slides. Had you not passed that previous agenda item, then we had one set of amended budgets, and had you passed it, since you did, we have a revised set ready to go for you. So the next item is the current year budget amendment resolution for 2016-2017. And this really just does a few things. It reconciles our current budget with actual expenditures projected to the end of the year versus what we budgeted initially. It includes some new revenues that we didn't anticipate earlier in the year. It addresses, this action that you just took for the atmospheric deposition sensors. And then it also looks at the fiscal year 15-16 carry forward. I think it's pretty straightforward, but I'll have Frank come up if you want to go through the details of each of those line items. And so that is the request, and this is by resolution. Adopt resolution 2017-04 that amends the fiscal year 2016-2017 current year budget.
Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'm going to make a motion that we approve the resolution 2017-04 for fiscal year 2016-2017 and amends our current year budget with the inclusion of the monitoring of the atmospheric deposition budget request. Does that handle that?
Yes, thank you. Second.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor and a second. Any other discussion? Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0.
Next item is business plan. My staff thinks I'm crazy, but I'm pretty excited about this agenda item. Having watched the National Estuary Program over the last 25 years, where the business plan was actually the EPA work plan. So it was a proposal that went out, contracts and grants happened. When we changed our structure, we effectively became a different business model where we have multiple revenue sources, and the EPA work plan is only a part of what we do. And so this business plan, and I'm not going to go through it line by line, basically takes the work that we see coming for the next fiscal year, aligns it with our budgets, provides output and outcome statements for every activity. And I really only want to showcase today two aspects of this business plan. But I remember Drew Bartlett a number of meetings ago say, with a small staff and so much to do, you need to stay in the lane. I think this defines the lane for next year. And so first and foremost, I want you, and there isn't a way to really do this. I don't think we have another slide on support of this, do we? Maybe we did. And I don't want you to spend a whole lot of time on this, other than I do want you to take a hard look on page 3. When we did the brand charter 2 meetings ago with the Ideas consultants, Many people that came to me later thought, wow, that's a really good brand for the National Estuary Program. And I want to just go on the record, and it's not just our program brand. This is the brand for all of us. This is the brand for the communities, the 5 counties, 45 cities, 1.7, this idea of one lagoon, and the vision, the mission.
Dwayne, excuse me, just, my screen is black. Is there any way you can?
Could you go ahead and pop that over to the screens on panel?
We
The
have
others
it.
are up,
She
it's just
doesn't.
mine. That's okay, I'll look at this
Might
one.
have
That's
something
okay.
disconnected.
And so I just wanted to steer you. I'm not going to go through those vision, mission. The promise, I think, is a bold promise of clean water. But you are going to see this as a recurring theme in almost everything we do. And I just wanted to bring this up because this will be my eyes as your executive director. If what we do doesn't meet these, then we're out of the lane. But it's a broad lane, but it is a very affirmational and high bar that we've chosen. And so the 4 goals that you identified early on before I was even hired fit beautifully with that. So that's number 1. Number 2, issue 2 though, the strategic priorities are important. And I want to make sure that I have captured what each of you and you collectively see as the next year's big outcomes. And interesting, some of our discussions in this meeting confirm some of our thoughts at staff of where these should be. So first and foremost, when you ask people, what do you most want? They want to know, is it safe to go in the water and what projects are you doing? The planning, all the things we have to do don't resonate with the citizens. So first and foremost is implementing the projects in our CCMP. That is going to be a priority. The revision of that CCMP, while it's planning, that revision will define the projects for the future 10 years, at least the beginning of those definitions. We're going to have, the third one is tactical, but it's important. We're going to get an audit review in October from the EPA, and we'll need to address those recommendations. Shouldn't take us long, I don't think, but I haven't seen what those recommendations are going to be yet. But a number of these are about capacity building, number 4, with our community, developing that 10-year, the long-range science and research. So what do we actually need to be thinking about where we don't have knowledge to do good decision-making? Number 6, which we talked about, we need to take a leadership role in monitoring and assemble who's doing what, where are they doing it, is it intensive enough, do we have the right spatial and temporal scale? That is on our 12-month window. Develop a comprehensive communication plan, and that is only going to take us, the plan itself will be quick. Implementing that plan is where we need to go. So if you ask me what is the most important thing for year 3, besides the projects, it's the citizen engagement and taking that brand charter that we talked about, with ideas, and actually taking that brand charter to our people, to the communities, the cities. They need to understand what it means to be lagoon friendly, and we need to get them all engaged on board. And that activation strategy, if we're successful in this year activating our brand, then we will have a formidable coalition and actually have the kind of support base that Representative Harrell and a number of our state senators and House members, I'm hearing from a number of them that they all see the need for recurring funding to do this work. Expanding our innovator and investor network, hugely important, I think. I am making good strides in Brevard. Once again, I'm going to ask for some introductions. Those of you who have, corporate contacts, people who are doing work in the lagoon that are private sector, I would like to have at least one representative from each of the 5 counties before the end of this calendar year. And it's my internal goal to double that number, the current number, so that this time next year that we have at least 20 to 25 corporate friends in the IRLI Squared network. We're working with NERT and ESERT to do that strategic plan for habitat restoration. And so that'll be working with that entire team that you saw today. And then, most importantly in my world is, we need to expand funding from multiple sources in places we never looked. We need to be working at the federal, state, local, and private level to drive our funding so we can drive projects. So those are my 10, and I wanted to spend some time on that to make sure that I have captured the things that you think are most important, and if you want to add one, we have the capacity to handle a couple more. This is a heavy lift, but we're committed to this heavy lift. And those of you who know, I haven't shied away from setting the bar high for me and my staff.
Indeed, it's pretty aggressive, and I'm very impressed.
Thank you, sir. To me, an essence of what we're doing is in the number one, because we're changing from just generics, we're changing to some rather hard, fast specifics of how we're measuring what we want to do and how we're going to try to achieve it. So as to give us motivation, to give us the strength to realize either we are bumbling or we're really making some good progress. And so to me, the number one in what we've talked about, and that's where I see us gaining support from the community as they see that there's actuality involved and not just verbal, that there's some really good things that are flowing as a result of this coming together. So to me, these other things are good. I'm not belittling that, but I think that number one is what's going to create the growing bond between the relationships of the agencies and the counties together. That's what I see it happening.
We agree. That's why number one was number one.
Yeah. Mr. Zadowski.
Mr. Chairman, move approval business plan as presented.
We have a second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second by Ms. Adams. Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0.
Okay, the next item is our budget for next year. And before I ask Frank to walk you through the specifics, there's an item in this that I want to address to you all with a budget request from the executive director. I am asking you in this agenda item, as we prepare our budget for next year, this amended budget, that even though the budget line item is not changing under staff salaries and support, I'm requesting a 5% merit pay increase for our Chief Operating Officer position and for our Administrative Communications Director. We made a decision early on to try to do this lean, and we are lean. I also set those original salary bases based on a pretty conservative mid-range understanding of where NEPs were around the state and the nation and what our market looked like. After over a year now working with our two staff, we have two exceptional hardworking individuals, and I also believe, based on the data that I see, that our salaries are about average and they have multiple hats. And so I'm making this recommendation as a merit pay adjustment to base salaries. The impacts to our overall expenditure budget in total, so salaries plus taxes plus FRS, is $7,808.50. That's annually. And so I'd like to address that first before I bring Frank up here, because I don't want to put him in an uncomfortable position since we are talking about their salaries.
Mr. Fielding.
Please, and I think that's good, and I think we ought to separate that item out from the rest of the vote. And I would have 2 or 3 basic kinds of questions I think we need, because here's a lot of the members here are in agencies or in counties, I know in our county, I don't keep up with everybody else's budget, but I know in our county, we don't just pass increases to staff on an annual basis. In fact, we may go 3 or 4 or 5 years. We haven't planned to pass any increase to staff over the last 3 years. What we do is we certainly increase in the health benefits and things that we have. So I think we need to have some history. I don't want us to get into a situation where we particularly Martin County, we're doing certain things that I see as being conservative, so we can take money and send it to somebody that's going to do things that we're not even doing. So, I mean, I just want you to be appreciative of that. We are the members. We are we're given the money. So give us some background. We started off at some levels. Each of us here would have individuals in their staff, at least one, maybe multiples, who do these jobs. I mean, these jobs aren't unique. We do these jobs. We do that job. We do this job. We have some that candidly do your job. We have those jobs done. So we have individuals that do those kind of jobs. And how do we start with, I think maybe let's give the history and where we are. Please, sir.
Okay, this is what's unique about us compared to at least the local municipalities, you know, and also there's some differences between us and DEP and the water management districts. Our decision to stay at minimal staffing creates a reality where each of us is doing multiple jobs across 5 counties, 45 cities. It's a big territory that we cover. I know what the time burden is and the workloads that my 2 staff are under. It's extreme. It's maybe not even sustainable, but having been in this position in different capacities before, I know that the biggest expense you have is when you lose a really valuable member of your team because you didn't take considerations for the ability to move ahead. And so I brought this to you partly because there is absolutely no guidance in our documentation about salaries, or cost of living. And so there's no clear direction in bylaws or policy. And so I bring this to you for your consideration. And I can tell you that based on the information that I have from other national estuary programs, including the 3 other ones in Florida, that our staff right now are in that average median wage structure, but many of them have twice the number of staff. Tampa Bay, I think, has got 6 or 7. And so I'm looking at workload, I'm looking at performance, I'm looking at where we head from here. And so I'm actually looking for you all to give me some guidance, and I set that 5%. Looking at where we were, one salary at $75,000 for our chief operating officer, which would go to $78,750 base, and then this combination of communications from $65,000 base to $68,250. And so it's hard to compare one job to another. So, in Brevard County, somebody who is the department chair of natural resources has a much bigger territory than some other counties as it relates to Lagoon. So I did not try to do those kinds of comparisons because they just simply weren't useful to me. So I'm recommending what I think is appropriate for a competitive salary based on the experience and the workload and especially the performance that we're getting out of our staff.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
I looked at this and we've had discussion about this, and the thing is too, we've come through a tough economy, and I will speak for Volusia County. Well, we're at 3% for our employees, union and non-union, across the board, but it's apples and oranges here, because right now we're having a tough time filling some positions, so it's not It's not just the pay. I remember when we were first starting and we were looking at the structure of this organization, the Indian River Lagoon Council, we started at a bare minimum. We have the 2 staffers, basically. So with the thought that you were going to expand very genuinely your base and those that work. So we have minimum staff. So the opposite of this is if we don't keep qualified people and appreciate what we have, the next request is going to be, do we need to add another support staff position? And very genuinely, I was waiting for that, and I think that's kind of how we structured from the beginning. So for you to do what you're doing with your current staff level at which you have, I think exceeds expectations from where we're going and what's being requested and demanded of you. And Council, if you look at what we're adding so much detail and demand to outcomes. This looks really good on paper, but the implementation of what we're going to ask staff to accomplish this next year is extreme. It really is. It's a big shift, Dwayne. So with that, my suggestion, Council, is that we leave it, the agenda item as it is. We not separate it out. I'm going to support it because the economy is getting better, and I don't know about you and your positions, but we are being cannibalized by private industry and businesses that are recruiting from within, from that which we've established, because we cannot compete with private industry, in the government sector. We just can't. So I'm doing everything I can to keep those qualified in a position. So I understand what you're saying, but I want to keep it as an agenda item, and I'm going to support your request as executive director
Dennis,
because
is that
the demand
a
is
motion?
higher. That's my motion, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, second.
Okay, we have a
Comment?
motion on the floor, second. Any
And
other
I don't-
discussion?
Yes, there is.
Mr. Fielding?
And I don't know if we do with Roberts or what, but as a point of personal request, was to separate the items, and so I just see that as,
Was that a motion? Was that a motion, Mr. Fielding?
yeah, I'll
We
make
have
a
a-
substitute motion that, yes, we do separate the items. That was the request.
Well, we would need a second for that.
And
Do we have to dispose of the first motion?
no. And with that, to suggest that we have 2% instead of 5. I'm reluctant to get us into a habit of doing something that is not being done in the member group, within the member group. So I think we need to be cognizant of where the water level is. So,
Mr. Chairman? Ms. Anseh?
Just to clarify, in terms of the process here, the budget amendment itself does not require, nor does it have any influence on the salary change, because the total
Can you
budget.
speak into the microphone?
I'm sorry, I apologize. The budget amendment itself does not, is not connected in any way to the salary increases, in that the line item for salaries was originally $350,000. And since it's not being exhausted, given the reduced staff you have, these adjustments can be made within that. From my way of thinking, from a legal perspective, based on your personnel policies, your bylaws, and your interlocal agreement, Dwayne is bringing this to you, quite frankly, I think from a position of full disclosure.
Exactly.
As your executive director, he's legally responsible under your personnel policies for employing staff, evaluating them, and determining merit increases. I think he's sensitive to the issues you all have and may express and are expressing today. But the reality is, you all don't hire, fire, supervise day-to-day these employees. So from my perspective, this conversation really isn't one about you authorizing it. It's him trying to be transparent and advise you of what he's doing internally.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
So, I appreciate the transparency, and I agree with Ms. Ansey that really on the budget side, that you're not changing the budget, so, there's that. We're not actually voting on one or the other on the raise. And I guess that's a question I had. So one was, is this a salary adjustment, looking across, or is this sort of an annual raise? Because you started off saying, the transparency here is really to get feedback from the board and to see what the board's thinking is. And so my thinking is very different on one versus the other. And my thinking would be different on supporting one versus the other one. So I guess that's an open question.
This is a salary adjustment, not an annual raise.
Okay. And so I suspect that you've been, as you said, you've looked across the other NEPs in the state of Florida, and that adjustment's within the realm.
It's almost impossible to kind of decipher the data I have, because every one of these job descriptions are a little different. If I could categorize in general, we are at average median possibly across that board, but we've got a higher standard of living, cost of living here on the coast. And my decision to bring this to you was that these are not average employees. And so my worry is that it is a competitive world. And in fact, there's a tremendous cost to doing, unplanned replacement of staff when they move on, especially after training. And so this is an adjustment where I think the base should be, because to be perfectly honest, the base that I set when I first came on board was just kind of a quick check of where I thought the market was at the time and where I thought we could be competitive at a minimum level to get the right people. So the staff did not ask me for a raise. This is me coming to you, with an adjustment of base, and I did not want to do that. Just like the truck, I could have made that truck decision without bringing it to you all because it fell below the $25,000 threshold, but I am not just sensitive. I am keenly aware that we are operating with taxpayer dollars and that we have to have full transparency. And every dollar we spend, we need to be asking the question, is this the appropriate use of public dollars? Right. So I do it with an abundance of caution and an abundance of sense of responsibility.
Yeah, I agree that the optics with dealing with public funds is very different than dealing in the private. So I appreciate that, like I said, that transparency. So you're looking at this as more of a salary adjustment, as we've come into this a year or two versus an annual cost of living raise or an annual raise. I guess my question I'll just ask, or next year we're going to be sitting here and having the same discussion.
We could be having a whole different discussion next year, but this year this is not anticipated as an annual cost of living or a recurring request. There's no question that in the public sector, we have an exodus of, really good staffers at times when we don't contemplate cost of living on an appropriate schedule. It may not be annually. We're seeing that in the universities. We're seeing that in many public sector areas, especially with the private sector. But this is a base salary adjustment based on my analysis of who we have in these jobs and what their responsibilities are in those job titles.
Mr. Sadowski.
Mr. Chairman, a couple of things, and this goes back to then Councilman Bornick several meetings ago asked a question of this board to look at negotiating and extending your contract, which I think we still need to do. And during that conversation, I asked a question, about salary. Were you expecting a salary increase? And you said no. But this shows leadership.
Really, I don't think I said it just like that.
But my point really is more to the to the leadership side, is that he's not asking for himself. He's asking for his staff. But even more importantly, he's put into the business plan, expanding the funding options and opportunities for this agency, if you will. And that'll be a benchmark that you set, that we can expect that there'll be some new funding options and opportunities for the NEP. Like has been stated up here, each of us in our counties, we are being just taken by storm by outside agencies, moving some of our best and brightest people off of our payrolls, and for a couple $1,000s to keep the brightest and the best in place, the loss of that, the cost of replacing somebody, getting them up to speed alone is a year or probably 18 months. Frank specifically has been here through many iterations of what we are today. And that institutional knowledge is, to me, worth the couple $1,000. That alone, and the input of 3 individuals running an organization that spreads out over 156 miles on a linear scale, not to mention the entire square mileage of that area, is incredible to me. How you do it is amazing. How you keep us all informed is amazing. Your community input and participation is amazing by all 3 of you. So I again, from a salary adjustment standpoint, I don't know that we can do 5% a year every year over year. I don't think that's going to be an option. And we may have to contract down the road depending on funding sources. But I think you set a benchmark, you set a business plan forward that really gives you the ownership of finding additional funding moving forward so that this agency can do even more work. So I'm supportive of moving forward with the salary adjustment of 5% within this budget, and I appreciate the openness that you've provided us with this opportunity to have a discussion.
We have a motion on the floor from Mr. Fielding. Do we have a second? Hearing no second, that motion fails. We have another motion on the floor. And before we take a vote on that, I would like to weigh in as well. Having been in the business community for some 40 years, I always felt that my most valuable commodity was my employee. Because if you don't have good employees, you can't move forward. And so sometimes you're saddled with some employees that are mediocre, and that's just the way it is. But when you get employees that excel, you have to do what you can to keep them. Sometimes you can't. But I think it's good to be proactive, and we have 2 very talented people on your staff. And I've seen what they do. I see how hard all of you work, including you, Doctor. And I think, and you've just disclosed to us today, you're adding things for you guys to do and to accomplish. So with that in mind, I will support this also. Any other comments? Okay, we have a motion on the floor to accept this. We have a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passes 8-0.
Thank you for the thoughtful consideration of that. And I'm going to turn it over to Frank just so I can sit down and let him talk about the actual budget amendment.
Thank you, members of the board. That last item was the budget amendment. What I have for you is 8D, the RFQ grant writing services. If you'll recall, instead of going out for an RFP for grant writing services, a request for proposal, management board recommended and you approved a request for qualifications process for grant writing services for our next fiscal year. For that process, we had 9 respondents. Those respondents' proposals were reviewed by a review team, and then those proposals were ranked 1 through 9. The review team met in the sunshine to make a recommendation to the management board that the council negotiate with the top 3 ranked proposals for services agreements for grant writing services. The management board on their review approved that and recommend to you, as I am here today, that we negotiate with the top 3 proposal RFQ grant writing vendors, Angie Brewer and Associates, Nashua Strategies, and T. Pinney and Associates for service agreements for next fiscal year. To remind you, this item has a budget of up to $80,000 in the next year. So it was the review team and the management team, board's observation that having 3 grant writing providers would better allow us to match up the right grant writer with the right applicant for whichever service they were going after. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about the process.
Yeah, please. What role did we have been exposed to the procedures and success from some of these, and I guess the lack of success from some of them. I don't know that we've had that, but I think we've always had pretty good success. So what role did that play in the evaluation?
That was a ranking criteria, the success of the individual proposer. So that was part of the review, that the team took a look at each one of these vendors at their success rates as they had throughout their career. So that was an item that was looked at.
Mr. Chair?
Any other comments? Mr. Sadowski?
Frank, I was really surprised at some of the disparities by the individual rankers. One has a 1, and then it goes to 6 for the other. I mean, that was surprising to me, and also some of the folks that did not come in, who have been with the either St. John's or South Florida having input, were ranked so high or low, and I don't know how you're looking at this thing, but high or low.
I wish I could go into the minds of the review team. There was discussion about some of the ranks being different, but I believe it came down to an individual's desire to try to find a grant writer that was a really good fit for the anticipated needs of our municipalities and our small cities in the watershed. So I believe that was primarily a driver for some of these different scores up and down.
Which leads me to the question, what defines success on the grant writing side? Was it a grant writing for building a road, or is it grant writing specifically to water quality? Is it for individual projects? Because if somebody's getting grants to build a building or to build a road, that's one set of skills. But this is a very different animal, and the contaminant loading, nutrient loading, the removal, all those things, writing for those particular grants is a different skill set. So what is the definition of success for these individuals, or these groups?
That's a thoughtful question, and I think with the top 3, and this is, the review team, again, they had a good discussion about these top 3, kind of highlights the difference in skill sets that these 3 bring. The top ranked, Angie Brewer and Associates, large firm. They do a lot of business, big infrastructure. So there's your opportunity for these large stormwater. For instance, maybe some of the projects that were identified in the IRL feasibility study. And Nashua and T. Penny each had, T. Penny, I think, had quite a bit of engagement, quite a bit of education. And then Nashua had a very deep familiarity with the legal process, with the legislative process. So I think in making their recommendation, and I'm not speaking out of line for them, they thought with these 3, we would have an opportunity based on the grant funding source and purpose to match up with the city or the municipality.
So let me ask a final question. If we move forward with these particular 3, is there anything stopping the NEP or staff reaching outside of those 3 down the road if a specific skill set was available that may not be in the wheelhouse of the top 3?
I'm not sure that, I'm going to let Ms. Anseh answer that one. It sounds like it may be outside of the process.
If you're going to award contracts to the 3 and want to then subsequently contract with another firm that either wasn't in that top 3 or didn't propose, unless there's another exemption in our procurement policy, and there may be because this is a consultant type service, you wouldn't be able to do that. But again, we do have a number of exemptions, and so I would have to look at that more closely. Because again, we've competitively procured this and gone through a process. So at this point, you couldn't pull number 7 out kind of on the fly next year if you thought it was a good fit. You could certainly award more contracts. The RFP did provide for excuse me, the RFQ did provide for a consideration of multiple contracts. But I don't think you could just pull one out if they didn't enter into a contract now.
And there's a contract based on whether it's a dollar value with the administrative fee going back to the group, or do we pay them up front? Meaning,
We would pay for services, and I'll give you a hypothetical. If in this next year, we had only large infrastructure grants, and it was a recommendation that those grant requests go through Angie Brewer and Associates, there's a possibility that Nashua and T-Penny would see zero funds in the next year because we simply didn't use those services. So we would negotiate service agreements. We would understand the rate structure for each one of these and have an idea of how much they would charge for different grant type opportunities. And then if we have grants that come across and we push them towards that vendor, then we would be billed for services.
okay, because oftentimes, you know, building into the grant request is the administrative fee, and sometimes that takes you out of the game for a grant if you increase the administrative portion of the grant outside of what the agency, the grantor, would provide. So it can be difficult if you're looking for the administrative fee and you're looking for 22% when it's outside the scope of 17% or whatever the number is. We could disqualify ourselves. So that needs to be a concern that we pay attention to.
And we'll certainly be aware of that.
Chair?
Mr. Tredick.
My concern on this would be, having worked for local governments and you have a large pool of annual contracts, if people don't get work, and it sounds like that is a possibility, they're going into the RFQ process anticipating getting a piece of the pie, but if they don't, it could affect future procurements, future RFQs. So I understand what you said about the different skill sets. I think that's a valid concern. I just don't want to grow the field too big. I want to keep it narrow so that you can use the consultants. I think that's important to, you know, how they view us and how they view our procurement. If we put an RFQ out there and then we don't give them work and we spend all 80,000 or most of it with another one, that's not, I don't think it's good for our future procurements.
That's an excellent observation. Thank you.
So I'll just recommend caution there.
Ms. Adams?
And I would agree with that comment. The other thing I would like to mention is, you know, there was a process to select these contracts and award these. That process ended up with a unanimous vote from the management board. So having not sat in on that process or been privy to those conversations, I'm looking at what's being recommended and the rankings, and it would appear that there was, based on a unanimous vote, pretty clear direction that that is the way everybody wanted to move, irregardless of how they individually ranked each applicant. So, you know, I'm supportive of the top three. I think that gives you kind of a wide enough room to wiggle depending on what grant opportunities are coming down that we might need to look into, but it doesn't give you so much that realistically they probably will at least end up with one or two projects each. So I think it covers all of our bases. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments from the board?
Move approval.
We have a motion for approval. We have a second. Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0.
Thank you, members.
Next item, Mr. Chair, is an update of our legislative position document. If you recall, a little over a year ago, we spent a lot of time wordsmithing a position statement that we would use, and it would allow me to use when I'm out and about, either talking to legislators, either in the state or at the federal level. So what staff has done is to take that original document and update it with very, very clear awareness of the discussion that happened a year ago to make sure that we weren't getting our state and water management district partners in that, you know, strange area where it looked like we were, you know, specifying some legislative action, you know, that was outside of the realm of either their agencies or the interests of the governor's office. And so before you today is a it's a one-page document, 2 sides. that basically increases or improves the language by being more succinct, but also advances the position that we were at. And if you remember that original document, the big issue at the table was WRDA reauthorization and reauthorization in the NEP. We were successful in both. And so at the federal level, we're thanking our congressional delegates for the reauthorization of the NEP, and we have 3 points where we're requesting accelerated appropriations for Everglades and Southern Indian River Lagoon restoration, implementation of the NEP's CCMP plan, so that's the projects, including funds for a competitive grants program that has already been authorized by Congress. So that was part of the reauthorization bill, competitive grants program. And then because of the sensitivities and issues down south and knowledge that there were at least some budgets in DC that were cutting pretty deeply harmful algal blooms, we kept that human health component, recommended that the continuation of funding for NOAA's harmful algal bloom research with increased attention to toxic cyanobacteria, non-toxic brown tide, and emerging HABs of concern. So that's the federal level of this. At the state level, the language is virtually similar, if not exactly the same as our last document. That, we point to the original legacy bill that Representative Harrell mentioned today, and I didn't show her this, so she hasn't seen it. It was just circumstantial that she came in today with that idea with us, but that looking for recurring funds, looking at Amendment 1, that is an important consideration for state legislative action. And lastly, in addition, was recognizing that there's a responsibility at the local community level to engage, at all levels, 5 counties and 45 cities, to look at what their impacts are and work together with us for solutions. The back page is just a reiteration in a much more succinct manner of our 7 non-scientific actions, the reduce, remove, restore, rebuild, research. That is resonating, and to be perfectly honest, when I talk to elected officials at all levels, they go, gosh, we love that, you're gonna rebuild something. It's action-oriented. It relates to Commissioner Fielding's comments about, what are we actually doing? And so I bring this to you. Hopefully you had a tight review of this. You all know the session, for all intents and purposes, has started, but committees start meeting the first week of September. I've already done a half a dozen legislative briefings, and so I really do feel an urgent need to get this ready for our ability to distribute it as needed when we do briefings. So unless there are editorial comments or changes, the request is to approve this legislative document for distribution as needed.
Pleasure of the board.
Move.
We have a motion to approve. We have a second. Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0.
And I'm going to ask Kathy to come up on this last agenda item, which is looking forward past this calendar year to 2018 in a meeting agenda.
Good morning. So we have 2 alternatives for you in terms of the meeting calendar for next year. The first one is to basically stay the same, so it would be status quo with, we are going to notice monthly meetings, but hold bi-monthly meetings, so we can continue just as we were going on as usual. The other is to hold quarterly meetings, and we would still notice additional meetings so that if they're needed, we can have them. But in using those notice meetings, we would also add the addition of things like science summits, which was something that was brought up at the STEM, where you could have workshops and invite members of the management committee in their notice meetings, so it won't be any conflict. And we can discuss issues of science or issues of engagement, things of that nature. So that, those are the 2 alternatives, basically. With quarterly meetings, too, we can rotate them around. There was a mixed feeling in the management board about that. A lot of people wanted to keep the venue that they meet at now, and some folks were okay with moving around to different venues. So you can discuss as needed, and we just need to know what you'd like to do.
Sure.
Mr. Fielding.
Please. I would encourage us to go ahead and notice. It might be that we need, in other words, no change. And so that we go ahead and notice. It might be that we find utility in having the more frequent meetings. So if we've got them noticed, then we can if we do. Also request for the way we're structured, Tuesday, I would like to be able to attend those Tuesday things, but we're structured so that that's our board meeting, and other folks probably have different days at their board meeting, but I certainly would like to be able to attend that management board meetings, and don't know how. I'm just asking that maybe we not just automatically make that Tuesday all the time. So that's because Tuesday
The management board has asked us to look at that as well.
Ma'am?
The management board has asked us to look at that Tuesday as well. There are some folks have conflict with that.
Even a Monday, I mean, Mondays are probably pretty good.
We're going to examine and see what the venue has to offer in terms of free days.
Yeah, because I would like to, the management board has some good interaction, and I would like to be able to have access to that. So the motion is that we not change, that we have option A, please, and that encourage that we look at a different day for the management board.
Mr. Zadowski.
Discussion?
Yeah, I was just going to ask it for clarification. What I heard you say was to move forward with the noticing of the monthly meetings, but you had two options, quarterly or bi-monthly.
Correct, yes.
And so I just wanted to make sure I understood the motion. Is it the quarterly one or the bi-monthly? Because I think, now that we are up and running, probably quarterly, with the idea of being able to have additional workshops to give us more latitude from a standpoint of understanding education and some of the projects that come through, might be as valuable, if not more valuable. But from a quarterly standpoint, it gives us an opportunity to have a little bit more time between meetings, but if we need them, we can have them. So I just wanted for clarification.
If I can interject just quickly, that was the feeling of the management board as well. They voted to approve, or voted to recommend quarterly meetings, but they understand that you may have different thoughts on that, so they're going to follow whatever you all decide.
Okay, so the question is to Mr. Fielding.
Well, the request was that we continued to give notice, so that gives us the flexibility.
Sure.
And if that means if staff is of the opinion that quarterly can more regularly fit what we need, I'm not going to generate extra stuff just to have a meeting. But I want us to have the flexibility so that if we have notice, then we can have when we need. So it's okay if the quarterly is what everyone, then I'm certainly accepting that.
So in other words, what I'm hearing is you're not making a motion specifically for quarterly or for bi-monthly?
Yeah, the motion, I'm sorry, thank you, Kurt, Chair. The motion is that we not change in the sense that we give notice for every month. And the second aspect of that is that that would be regularly looking at a quarterly meeting, perhaps interspersed with workshops or whatever.
Okay.
Ms. Dennis.
Mr. Chair, scheduling, we're all very extremely busy, and I would rather know what we're going to do than what we may or may not do. I think it would be more efficient if we went to quarterly meetings and rotated locations. I would support that. I mean, I look at my calendar, we've got it on now where the next motion is going to be to cancel September's meeting. Well, I can tell you on my calendar, I've got two other actions there that I'm holding a place for if and when this meeting gets canceled, and I think we're probably all doing the same. So for expediency and efficiency, I'm only going to support quarterly meetings. I think we're ready for that. I think we have the supporting documents and staff is ready with our plan of work and they may be longer meetings, I'm okay with that too. I would prefer a longer meeting once a quarter, and think that rotating locations would be a very good thing too. In fact, if and when council approves that, should you approve that, I would like Volusia County to put us on the top of the list. We would love to host you and showcase Volusia County as a location. But with that, for me, I'm only going to support very specific quarterly meetings for scheduling and efficiency purposes for staff and the council. Thank you.
Ms. Adams?
Yeah, I'm fine with the quarterly meetings. I really like the idea of having workshops or science summits. I think we get a lot of presentations that come here. And while they're very informative, I feel like sometimes we don't have enough time to really delve into those subjects because of the business that we're trying to accomplish at the same time. So maybe separating those out, and maybe those aren't mandatory that we as board members have to attend, but I think it's very important for our partners and the other committees and for us that are interested in certain subjects to be able to do that. So I really like that idea. As far as moving and rotating locations, I can understand your desire to do that, being the farthest, you have to travel the farthest from Volusia. I usually have to do that within Indian River County as I live the farthest away, so I'm fine with traveling. Whatever is appropriate for everybody is fine with me as far as that goes.
Mr. Fielding?
I don't hear anything other than we didn't get a second. The motion was that we provide for the flexibility and that the specificity was that we do the quarterly. And the comment was that that might give us opportunity to have workshops otherwise. So I don't know that we had
Second the motion.
anything that
I'll
was
second.
different from what,
She said the same thing.
yeah, I didn't see it being different from what, because
Well,
we
but
didn't
that's
get
the-
into the location.
But that's not quarterly meetings. That's just we leave everything calendared and then we decide month by month what we're doing. We're
No.
is that not?
No, that's
Am I missing something?
not. Yes, ma'am, you are.
What am I missing?
Okay, so word your motion so that everybody's on the same page.
How we have done previously is that we have, because at the first, all of us are probably familiar with this, at the first of the year, you need to go ahead, it's sufficient to go ahead and set up meeting times and give notice and put it in the paper so that you don't have to do that repetitively. So that would give us the opportunity to be flexible. But the objective that we're talking about is to set up for those quarterly meetings. Should there be something that needs done, we don't have to figure out how in the world are we going to get it noticed, because we've already got it noticed. It's then just a matter of pulling it together structurally and administratively.
So just so I'm clear, you want us to reserve 12 slots, and we'll fill 4 of those with quarterly meetings?
Yes.
And then the rest of them would be open?
Right.
Okay.
And that's the motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second it. And again, just for Ms. Yancey's side of the equation, in that we have a workshop or so on and so forth, we would be limited in not being able to take action unless it was a action item or a meeting associated with action.
That's correct for a workshop, but just I want to clarify, if I may, real quickly. Since we're a special district of the state of Florida, we have slightly different noticing requirements than you have in your counties in the Water Management District. And under Chapter 189, we have to notice our meetings for the year. So as Commissioner Fielding points out, we have been noticing every single, at the beginning of the year, all 12 months. But then what it requires staff to do is, since that's been advertised, it's been noticed with the state, and it's posted, there's subsequent action that has to be taken every time we cancel. Because we've told the public, we've advertised in newspapers across all of your counties that we are going to have a meeting next month, when in fact we're not. So I think what staff is trying to achieve is to maybe more narrowly focus on the meetings you're actually going to have, so it'll eliminate that task of canceling them every month. And then if you want to reserve a couple days for you can call them workshops, but we're still going to have to notice them under 189. There's not quite the same distinction. We're still going to have to notice them. So however you want to structure the workshops is fine, but again, to notice 12 months of meetings and then really only have 6 or 4 does put that burden on them every month, as well as you having an agenda item to actually act to cancel it because of, again, those unique requirements for special districts.
And Ms. Nancy, I'd also like to clarify that if you scheduled 4 quarterly meetings, and if there was an action item that came up, then it would just be noticed with the required days for us to have that meeting. Is that correct?
That's right. If you're saying if you wanted to have one in addition to the quarterly meetings, I think what staff is proposing is you schedule those quarterly meetings, and maybe we notice 2 others. We kind of know, based on now having operated for 2 years, when our budget requirements are going to kick in, how the contracting works, and when the cycle is. If there were to be an emergency, certainly we have a little bit more leeway on an emergency basis. But I don't think that we'll have a problem if you go to option 2, I guess, in making the work fit in that meeting schedule as we envision it.
Sure.
Okay, so, Mr. Fielding.
Please. In light of Ms. Yancey's clarification, then I'll modify the motion to be a quarterly.
Does your second change as well, Mr. Zizowski?
I'm looking at staff. Staff, are you okay with that?
We are.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
I second.
Okay.
Call the question before we go.
So we have a motion before the board, and we have a second for noticing quarterly board meetings.
Does that include with workshops and rotating locations?
Yes, we will notice additional days for workshops and rotate locations.
I don't favor rotating.
Okay, so that's not part of the motion. So the rotating locations is not part of the motion.
Okay, but the workshops are. We have to be clear. We're walking in talking in circles here.
Mr. Chair, could I make a suggestion?
Absolutely.
I'm actually going to try to interpret act. Right now, if we looked at 4 quarterly meetings next calendar year, looking at October, January, April, June, which would allow us to meet our obligated dates, if we had kind of summits in the just 4 additional summit dates. So I'm going to just say right at the moment something in December, March. Actually, it would be June, because the July would be the meeting. Then, in fact, we could rotate those workshops and maintain the quarterly meetings here, which you would still get the same benefit of rotating. We really think that you all need to start seeing kind of more of the lagoon. For example, I was with a number of people the other day and asked how many of you actually stood on the Herbert Hoover Dike. These were environmental people, and hardly anybody, from Brevard had ever seen Lake O in the real scale. And so what we could do is that. So you'd have 4 noticed meetings. We'll go ahead and pre-notice with that annual notice that another 4. And those would be, summit meetings. We won't declare that. We just need to notice the meeting. And that would give us the option. We won't call them workshops, that if we had to have another meeting, you won't have to declare an emergency. We'll just use one of those summit dates and combine a workshop or combine a science summit with whatever business we have to do.
Mr. Fielding, does that work for you?
Please.
Second's good.
Yep, amended motion.
Frank, were you able to decipher all that? Okay, we're good. Okay, does everybody understand where we're going with this? Okay, we have a motion. We have a motion on the floor, and we have a second. Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0.
Good job. That was a tough one.
Well,
That's good.
shame to me.
You pulled it out.
Moving right along. Dr. DeFries.
Well, I'm going to let the chair talk about a field trip, but I do want to give a quick update on the federal side. We had the 3rd Congressional House Caucus meeting and workshop on July 20th up in Washington, D.C. Congressman Posey is working with the 3 other co-chairs, and they reached out and they said they wanted to focus on economic development, and how estuaries and business work together. There were 4 slots for presentations. Happy to say that 2 of those 4 nationally were Indian River Lagoon. In your package, you have a presentation from Linda Weatherman, the CEO and President of Space Coast Economic Development Council. And I put that in your package. We have it online because she really did a great job of connecting economic development to our estuaries. And then Bob Musser, who's a member of our management board, spoke on behalf of the American Association of Port Authorities, who sent letters to both the House and Senate appropriations in support of NEP appropriations. And so it was a dynamic discussion. The next quarterly is planned sometime in the fall, and I think they're going to focus on living shorelines. And these are done, you know, they're not hearings. It's basically a quiet lunch. Staffers come in, they get a piece of pizza, and we do a panel discussion and questions, and it's been very effective. And this last one was standing room only. They were out in the hallway of the Cannon building, you know, with pizza listening in from the hallway. So very effective. The good news at that meeting was that we are in the House Interior Appropriations budget. So level funding for the NEPs and also funding for the competitive grants program that was added as part of reauthorization. And so while we're still a long way from appropriation, we still don't know where the Senate stands, although we have good support from the Senate side. Some 20 members, you know, have signed a letter supporting Senate appropes. We need to have a constant vigil on funding, not just for the lagoon, but Everglades restoration as well. And so we'll keep you posted on that. By all means, as you see any of our congressional delegates, Senate or House, thank them for their support. They've all been working hard on our behalf. And then I will be sharing with you in probably the October framework, but I may do it individually with each of you just to get your individual comments back. We know where we're going with the Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan. It is comprehensive. If you want to see one just finished, Tampa Bay just put their full revision on the website. You get an idea of the scale and scope of these. Theirs is a little different than ours. They do not have projects. We are assembling projects. So once again, we're beginning to get projects from your representative counties, and you know, some of the programs have been sharing the feasibility study. But if you know of projects that are in need of funding, make sure you have either your staffs or your constituents get them to us so we can start building this list of potential projects. And then lastly, I'm going to defer to Carolyn. She just wants to give you an update on the interlocal.
Just real quickly, right before you, I've laid a copy of now the final second amended interlocal agreement that allowed for the inclusion of Indian River County. I've also provided it directly to your noticed entities or folks on our official list. So for the counties, it's mostly the administrators and your county attorneys, and for the agencies, the clerks. So it's already gone out. This is really more for you to, I'm sure, carry around and have with you like I do, wherever you go. The second document before you is just a brief outline on the Sunshine Law, public records, and ethics issues. Under Chapter 189, we're required to do continuing education of those issues. You all are seasoned government officials, get it. You're not coming into this blindly, but it's there again if you want to take a look at it. And with that, just if the officers could stay afterwards, we do have some documents for signatures. Thank you.
All right, let's move into board reports. Mr. Frick.
Well, I'll just be relatively brief and just, you know, one, also recognize, like I said, the good work that Dwayne and staff have done. Really appreciate how you responded to last meetings, requests, especially on the RFP side of things. So really appreciate that. Secondly, just let the folks know we are going through our budgeting process, and within at least the agency budget at this point, we're putting in there, we have the $250,000 from DEP for the NEP. That's in my budget, and that has, that's in there as of right now, so.
Good news.
Thank you.
Mr.
Good
Tredick.
start.
Nothing to report.
Mr. Tucker.
I was going to say good morning, but it's good afternoon.
Welcome to the NEP.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say how impressed I am with Dr. DeFries and the staff, the short time that I've had to meet with you, 2 or 3 meetings now before this actual meeting. Just, thanks to all of you, all the work that you've done in the last 2 years. It's a pleasure to be here, filling the very big shoes of Mr. Kevin Powers, who also replaced on the governing board at the Water Management District. As all of you may know, we have a new executive director at the South Florida Water Management District, Mr. Ernie Marks, who replaced Mr. Antonacci recently. So we're excited about his leadership there as well. And of course, we're moving into budget time coming up in September, so we'll be very busy, as all of you will be in your individual counties and agencies. But it's just a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to working with staff and with the council moving forward.
Ms. Denny's.
And I appreciate everything that staff has done. I think we have set a solid foundation and framework for going forward for restoring and preserving the lagoon. And it's full of promise. Thank you.
Ms. Adams.
I'm just glad to be at my first official meeting and looking forward to many more to come.
Mr. Zadowski.
Quickly, Paradise Park is in its final phase. Thank goodness for the final revenue from the NEP to push that project over the edge. Wesley's Island is prospering amazingly. It's one of the most amazing efforts I've seen from a community standpoint. There are people out there every single week taking care of the island. They've taken ownership of it. Friends of the Spoil Islands are also on their next project. The one thing that I brought forward last month that was quite contentious, and unfortunately St. Lucie County had to take action on the FDEP permit for a entity that wanted to do commercial biosolid composting. We were successful in passing our ordinance. It is currently in limbo, moving to a DOA administrative hearing. We believe, and this is where we as a group, we talk about how do we save money, how do we do better projects, and it's about reducing the input. This project that was presented wasn't even presented to the county for consideration. It went strictly to the regulatory agency without letting us know. And unfortunately, they were going to move 500 tons of Class B biosolids into a composting component in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, which is against the Florida statutes. And so that was something that we had to face. It's also in the St. Lucie County Basin Management Action Plan. And it also would directly, within 2 miles of the lagoon, have direct input in the C25 canal into the lagoon with 20,000 gallons per minute with, I believe it's 7 pumps that could remove water from that 6,700 acres, not 67 acres, 6,700 acres at 500 tons a day of Class B human waste biosolid. And so we have had to fight vehemently against the processing of Class B biosolids, human waste, in the watershed. And we have to pay attention to the regulatory agencies. And oftentimes, it's not because they didn't do their job. Oftentimes, it's because those who are seeing these permits come through are unfamiliar with the watershed, or sometimes maybe even unfamiliar with the components of the statute that says Class B biosolids are not permitted in the Lake O watershed or in the Indian River Lagoon impaired watershed. So that has to be a conversation that we as individuals, our staffs, have to look to the regulatory agency, explain to them, why it was not a good decision, or step up and explain or create that education component. Because sometimes, we've all had that issue when we had the recession. We lost a lot of good employees, and we had new employees that didn't have institutional knowledge. So we've got to be able to create that education component up the chain to the regulatory agencies and making sure they know and they are aware of these types of issues that are coming through. The fact that the entity has changed its land use from citrus to row crop changes their water permit too. They hadn't even gone that far yet in requesting a water permit. So they were going to kind of, I don't want to use the term bypass or not approach the issue from their drainage plan, but it wasn't presented to the water district, so the water district had no knowledge. Going from citrus to row crop, going from citrus to biosolid human waste composting commercial project is a very different use. And so we have to stay vigilant, and we have to be able to talk to our agencies and let them know why it's not right for our communities. We have a fight on our hands, each one of us from a county standpoint, cities, about home rule. Home rule is under attack, and we have to continue to maintain that we represent the people of our community, and we have to fight on their behalf. What is right for our specific communities, our cities, our counties, and so that's something, along the regulatory side, along what we're trying to do as an NEP, it all comes together, and that's why it's important for us to share the information to each other from this dais so that we all know what's going on in each of our regions. So,
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fielding.
That certainly is provocative. An underlying problem is it gives the same register as septic, so that we then think, well, septic is the source, and actually that biosolid is the source. And so that's, as best I understand anyhow, so that's a complication we might want to think about. Wastewater, here again, wastewater plants are not the automatic solution. We have a number of small wastewater plants that are on the lagoon. Every time it rains a little bit, that overwhelms them, and so they immediately discharge concentrated effluent into the lagoon, whereas septic tanks sort of seep it out gently, but these wastewater plants just sort of glurg it out in big splotches. So we need to think about that, and in fact, Representative, that might be a continuing source, because those are problems that we need to deal with that are quite expensive. That's existing wastewater plants that do not have the capacity to handle rain. Hardly anybody here really cares, but I'll just mention brief. The lake plans, and we're planning to spend billions of dollars, and I'll be glad to get involved with whomever. We're not going to solve the problems for the estuaries. That won't solve the problem. The estuaries will still receive the thrust of the water when we get all this water in the lake. The estuaries are going to, regardless of all this spend, I'll be glad to talk with whomever wishes to get into detail about that, but most of you don't really deal with that. Best pumping practice is something that all of us need to become, I think, consider, and that is, what can we do to quit moving the contaminant on down the line? So we've got it in a ditch somewhere, and what we have been doing all along is, as soon as the water goes up a little bit, and it goes to that next collector ditch, and it goes to the big one, and it goes eventually into a outfall somewhere, and so it goes into the lagoon. We need to think about that, because there are practices that will minimize that contamination moving down the ditch. And so whomever wishes, we can get into some of that, or we can maybe eventually even have a presentation about that, because it's a way, the closer to the source that we can address contamination, the least expensive it is. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. And for my board report, I'd like to thank and welcome Susan Adams and Brandon Tucker for being our new members, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your input. So moving on to our next meeting announcement, September 8th, 2017. That optional meeting requires a motion to cancel. So we have a motion to cancel. Do we have a second? We have a second. Anyone wish to vote no? Passes 8-0. Our council meeting will be on Friday, October 13th, right here, same time, same station. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.